Tonight, we're heading deep into the middle of nowhere, places where the roads disappear, the trees stretch for miles, and when something begins watching you from the darkness, there may be no one close enough to hear you scream. Our first story begins in March of 2002, when 4 college friends arrive at a secluded hunting camp in the Louisiana wilderness and discover that someone has been studying their every move. The second story: a man buys 40 acres at a tax auction for an unbelievable price, only to discover that the property was never truly abandoned. Somebody was already living there, and they have no intention of leaving. And the last story: after drunkenly storming away from a crowded carnival, a young man becomes lost in the woods, just before several voices begin closing in around him, and one of them shouts, "Grab him!" Before we begin, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another terrifying story. And if you like listening on the go or for sleep, follow the Just Creepy podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Now, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's begin. It starts in March of 2002. I was 21 years old, finishing my junior year at Northwestern State in Natchitoches. If you're not from Louisiana, that's pronounced Natchitoches. And no, I can't explain why. I grew up in Pineville, right outside Alexandria, and I'd been hunting and fishing the Kisatchie National Forest my whole life. My dad took me squirrel hunting out there when I was 8. I knew those woods. That's the part that still gets me, honestly. I knew those woods, and I never once felt unsafe in them until that week. There were 4 of us. Me, my roommate Bo, who I'd known since high school, a guy named Kyle who lived down the hall from us and had attached himself to our group freshman year and never left, which was fine, because Kyle was the kind of guy who'd give you his last $20 without thinking about it. And Dustin Arsenault. He's the one this story is really about, in a way, even though he'd probably tell you it's about me, since I'm the one who saw the man first. Dustin's uncle owned a camp off a gravel road south of Gorham, in the Kisatchie Ranger District, maybe a 15-minute drive from the Longleaf Vista Overlook if you know the area. When I say camp, I mean camp in the Louisiana sense. A cabin, 1 room, a wood stove, a screened porch, an outhouse, and a hand pump for water that his uncle swore was potable, and none of us fully trusted. The cabin sat on about 12 acres of private land completely surrounded by national forest. You turned off the parish road onto a dirt track, went through a cattle gate, and drove another half-mile through the pines before you even saw the place. No neighbors, no power lines, nothing. Spring break lined up with the opening of turkey season that year, and Dustin's uncle said we could have the camp for the whole week. We thought we'd won the lottery. 4 college guys, a truck bed full of beer, shotguns for the turkeys, fishing rods for Kisatchie Bayou, and 7 days with no classes and no girlfriends. I remember the drive in. Bo had a '96 Silverado, and we had the windows down, and it was one of those perfect Louisiana spring days before the humidity turns mean. And I remember thinking this was going to be one of those weeks we talked about for the rest of our lives. I was right about that part, just not the way I meant it. The first 2 days were exactly what you'd picture. We scouted for turkey sign in the mornings, fished the bayou in the afternoons, and sat around the fire pit at night drinking bush and telling the same stories we'd told each other 100 times. The cabin had 2 sets of bunks inside, but the weather was so good that Kyle and I set up tents in the clearing out front, more for the fun of it than anything. The fire pit sat between the tents and the cabin, and past the fire pit was maybe 40 yards of open grass before the tree line started. Longleaf pines mostly, with palmetto and yaupon thick underneath. During the day, it was beautiful. At night, once the fire was the only light, that tree line went completely black. The first night I saw him was our second night there. It was late. Bo and Dustin had already gone into the cabin. Kyle was passed out in his tent. I'd had, I'll be honest, probably 6 or 7 beers, and a couple pulls off a bottle of Evan Williams that Dustin brought, and I got up from my chair to walk to the edge of the clearing and take a leak. I didn't bring a flashlight. The fire was behind me, and the moon was up, maybe 3/4 full, and I could see well enough. I finished, zipped up, and when I raised my head there was a man standing in the tree line. I want to be careful here, because for years people treated this part of the story the way you treat a drunk guy's story. And I understand why, but I need you to understand what I actually saw. He was not deep in the trees. He was standing at the edge of them, just inside the first row of pines, maybe 25 feet from me. He was tall, taller than me, and I'm 6'1", shaved head or close to it. He was wearing what looked to me at the time to be a dark tank top or a cutoff shirt, and his arms and his neck were covered in tattoos. I couldn't make out what they were. In the moonlight, they just read as dark shapes covering his arms and running up the side of his throat, and he was standing completely still, facing me, with his arms down at his sides. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. He was just watching me. I'd love to tell you I did something brave. What I actually did was make a sound I'm not proud of, somewhere between a shout and a yelp, and stumble backward over a root and land on my tailbone. By the time I scrambled up and looked again, the tree line was empty, just pines and palmetto and dark. I ran back to the cabin yelling and got everybody up. Bo came out with a flashlight, Dustin came out with his shotgun, and Kyle crawled out of his tent asking who was cooking, which tells you what kind of shape Kyle was in. We walked the tree line with flashlights for probably 20 minutes. We didn't find anybody. Bo shined his light on the ground where I said the man had been standing, and said the grass didn't even look pressed down, though I don't know how much you can really tell about pine straw at midnight with a mag light. And then came the thing that shaped the whole rest of the week. Dustin started laughing, not mean laughing, just relieved laughing, and he said something to the effect of, "Travis, you are hammered, my man." And Bo picked it up, and then Kyle, and within 5 minutes the tattooed man in the tree line had become a running joke. By the next morning they were calling him my boyfriend. "Hey Travis, your boyfriend come back last night. Leave a plate out for Travis's boyfriend. Here's the thing. I halfway let them talk me into it. That's the part I've had to sit with for 24 years. Because I had been drinking, and it had been dark, and the human brain does do things at midnight in the woods. I wanted them to be right. It's a lot more comfortable to be the drunk guy who saw a shadow than the sober guy someone was watching. So I laughed along, and I told myself it was a trick of the moonlight, and for 2 days I almost believed it. Almost. Because small things started adding up, and I was the only one counting. The third morning, I found a cigarette butt on the dirt track about 100 yards from the gate, down where we'd parked the second truck. Hand rolled. None of us smoked. I told myself it was old, left by some hunter from deer season, except it didn't look old. It looked white. The fourth day, half a package of hot dogs went missing from the ice chest on the porch. Kyle got blamed for that, and Kyle, to be fair, was a plausible suspect for missing hot dogs, and he took the blame the way he took everything, with a shrug. But I watched him deny it, and Kyle was a terrible liar, and he wasn't lying. And then there was the feeling. I know that's not evidence. I know how it sounds. But there were 2 or 3 times that week, always in the late afternoon when the light started going orange through the pines, when the back of my neck would go tight, and I'd turn around and stare at the tree line, and see nothing, and be absolutely certain, in some old part of my brain, that the nothing was staring back. The second time I saw him was our 5th night. I'd cut way back on the drinking by then, partly because of the jokes, and partly because of that feeling. That night I'd had 2 beers, total, over about 5 hours, and I want that on the record. I was in my tent, almost asleep, when I heard the cattle gate. The gate was a half-mile down the track, but sound carries at night out there, and that gate made a specific sound, a low metal groan when it swung. We'd all commented on it, and at somewhere around 1 in the morning, I heard it groan, once, slow, and then stop. I lay there for a long time telling myself it was the wind. Then I heard footsteps on the dirt track, unhurried, even, getting closer, then leaving the track, then quiet on the pine straw. I got my flashlight in my hand, and I didn't turn it on, and I unzipped my tent about 4 inches as slowly as I have ever done anything in my life, and I looked out. The fire was down to coals, throwing off just enough red light to shape things. And standing next to Beau's Silverado, maybe 15 yards from my tent, was the man. Same build, same shaved head. He was crouched slightly at the driver's window with his hands cupped against the glass, looking inside the truck. Then he straightened up, and he turned, and for a second the coal light caught the side of his face and his neck. And I could see the tattoos went all the way up under his jaw. He stood there and looked at the cabin for a while. Then he looked at the tents. He looked at my tent. I don't know if he could see the gap in my zipper. I've spent a lot of nights wondering. Then he turned and walked back toward the track, no hurry at all, and he disappeared into the dark. And a few minutes later I heard the gate groan again, and then nothing. I did not sleep. When the sky went gray, I got Beau up and told him everything, and I watched his face do the thing I'd been dreading, that polite, skeptical settling, and he asked me, not unkindly, how much I'd had. 2 beers, I told him. He asked if I was sure, and Dustin came out onto the porch in the middle of this, heard the tail end, and grinned, and said the boyfriend was back, and something in me snapped, and I got loud, and then Dustin got loud, and for about 10 minutes on that porch, it got genuinely ugly between us, in a way it never had in 6 years of friendship. The compromise, and I had to fight for even this, was that we checked the truck. There were smudges on the driver's window. Could have been hand smudges, could have been anything. And it was Beau's truck, and Beau kept it filthy, so that went nowhere. And we agreed, mostly to shut me up, that we'd lock the guns in the cabin instead of leaving them in the trucks, and keep the cabin latched at night. If we'd left the next morning, this would just be a weird story I told at crawfish boils. We didn't leave. We had 2 days left, and Dustin had been hearing a gobbler every morning across the drainage northwest of the camp, and there was no version of 2002, where 4 21-year-old guys packed up early because one of them saw a scary man. So on the morning of our 6th day, our last full day, we went hunting. We split into pairs, which is how you hunt turkeys with 4 people. Beau and Kyle went east toward the bayou. Dustin and I took the drainage to the northwest after his gobbler, and I remember being glad it worked out that way, because Dustin and I hadn't fully patched things up from the porch. And 2 hours sitting against a pine tree together tends to fix that kind of thing between men who don't know how to apologize with words. We set up before first light on the near side of the drainage, backs against 2 big longleafs about 10 feet apart, facing a little natural clearing where Dustin figured the bird would strut. Dustin had his uncle's 12 gauge. I had mine. It was cold for March, low 50s, and the woods did that thing they do where the birds start up one section at a time, and the gobbler answered Dustin's call twice from across the drainage, and for about 40 minutes, I forgot completely about tattooed men and cigarette butts, and I was just a guy hunting turkeys with his friend. The first shot took the bark off the pine 8 inches above Dustin's head. I need to explain the sound, because the sound is what I still hear. A shotgun going off in the woods is a boom, round and wide. This was not that. This was a flat, vicious crack, a rifle, and it came with this ripping snap in the air that I later learned is what a bullet sounds like passing close to you. And in the same instant, the tree above Dustin just exploded. Bark and splinters rained down on his shoulders. And I want to be honest about the next 2 or 3 seconds because neither of us did anything smart. We just sat there. We both just sat there with our mouths open, because there was no version of reality we understood in which someone was shooting at us. The second shot fixed our understanding. It hit the dirt about a foot to Dustin's left and threw dirt across his legs, and Dustin made a sound I'd never heard him make and rolled sideways behind the pine, and I hit the ground flat, and the third shot cracked over us, and I remember lying there with my face in the pine straw doing the math that would keep me up for the next 20 years. 3 shots, all 3 at Dustin's tree. I was 10 feet away in the open for the first 2, and not one round came at me. Somebody was shooting at Dustin, specifically at Dustin. The shots were coming from across the drainage, from the high side, somewhere in the deadfall on the far slope, and we never saw so much as a muzzle flash. What we did was crawl. There was a shallow feeder cut running behind our position, maybe 2 feet deep, and we slid into it on our bellies and crawled east along it while a 4th shot smacked a tree somewhere above us. And I have a scar on my right forearm from dragging it over a broken root, and I didn't feel it happen and didn't notice until we were back at the trucks and Bo asked why I was bleeding. The crawl took maybe 10 minutes and felt longer than anything I had ever done. When the cut got deep enough, we got up into a crouch and ran, and we came out of the woods into the clearing yelling for Bo and Kyle, who came running from the other direction because they'd heard the shots and thought, at first, that we'd fired them. It took 30 seconds of both of us talking over each other before Bo's face changed, and I will say this for Bo. Once his face changed, it never changed back. Nobody made a boyfriend joke. Nobody ever made one again. We threw ourselves into the Silverado. All 4 of us. Left the second truck. Left the tents. Left everything. And Bo drove that dirt track at a speed that should have killed us independently of any sniper. There was no cell service out there in 2002. Not that any of us had a cell phone worth mentioning anyway. We drove to the little store up at the Parish Road Junction, the kind of place that sold live crickets and cold beer, and had a payphone bolted to the outside wall. And I stood at that payphone with my hands shaking and called 911. And I remember the operator asking me to slow down twice. The sheriff's office took it seriously. I'll give them that. And once the words shots fired and National Forest got strung together, it stopped being just them. Within a couple hours, there were parish deputies and agents from wildlife and fisheries. And by the next morning, the Forest Service was involved too. 2 deputies followed us back to the camp that first afternoon, and they went in ahead of us with their guns drawn, and watching 2 grown lawmen move up on our little vacation cabin with their weapons out did something to my understanding of the week that has never fully undone itself. The camp had been ransacked, not destroyed. Ransacked is the right word, because whoever did it was shopping, not raging. The cabin door had been pried at the latch. The ice chests were open and gutted, all the meat gone, the bread gone, the peanut butter gone, the beer untouched, which one of the deputies remarked on. My tent was unzipped and my duffel dumped out, and 2 things were missing that turned the whole scene from a burglary into a message. Dustin's box of .270 rifle shells, which had been sitting on the cabin shelf because his uncle kept a deer rifle out there in the fall, and Dustin had brought shells to zero it, was gone. And Dustin's sleeping bag off Dustin's bunk gone. Dustin's ammunition, Dustin's sleeping bag. Nobody else's anything, beyond food. My tent had been searched and my sleeping bag was still there, unrolled, gone through, and left. Bo's wallet was sitting in plain view on the porch table with $60 in it, untouched. The deputy taking inventory kept flipping back through his notes with his jaw set, and I finally asked him what he was thinking, and he was honest with me. He said, "Son, whoever this is, he's not stealing, he's picking." Then I told them about the man. Both nights, the cigarette butt, the gate, the truck window, all of it, and I braced for the skepticism I'd gotten all week, and instead I watched the 2 deputies trade a look. It was a fast look, but I caught it, and it wasn't a look that said drunk college kid. It was a look that said something to each other, something they already knew and weren't saying in front of us. Years later, I found out what it was. There'd been complaints going back at least 2 years, scattered across that whole district of the Kisatchie. Hunters' camps rifled, deer stands stolen or wrecked, a trapper who swore somebody had been sleeping in his shed, and one report, filed and quietly buried for lack of evidence, from a bow hunter who claimed a shot had been fired over his head near Corral Creek in 2000. They had a ghost out there, and they knew they had a ghost. and we were the first people the ghost had actually tried to hit. The search ran a full week. They brought dogs. One day they had a helicopter out of Alexandria working the drainages. They pulled in trackers from wildlife and fisheries, guys who'd spent their lives reading that ground. And what those men found is the part of this story that still moves the hair on my arms. He was living out there, had been for a long time. They found 3 camps. The closest one was inside of a mile from our cabin, tucked into a palmetto thicket on a low rise where, and a deputy told me this directly, a man sitting comfortable could watch our clearing through the pines. A lean-to of cut saplings and stripped pine boughs, weathered gray, months old at minimum. A fire pit dug down and ringed and swept. Snare wire in the brush. A latrine trench. Empty cans buried in a neat pit, and some of those cans, the deputy said, had store labels that had been out of circulation for over a year. The second camp was 3 miles off, older. The third was older still, half reclaimed by the woods, and it had a sleeping platform built up off the ground between 2 trees, and hanging on it were the rotted remains of a sleeping bag, which is a detail I could have lived my whole life without, because it means the man had a system, and the system had worn out and Dustin's sleeping bag wasn't loot. It was a replacement part. They never found him. 7 days, dogs, a helicopter, men who could track a wounded deer across rock, and they never laid eyes on him once. The woods out there run on for tens of thousands of acres, cut with drainages and thickets, and a man who knew them, who'd made himself part of them, could fall back and fall back forever. The camps got photographed and torn out. The case stayed open. And after a week, everybody had to go back to their lives, because that's how it works. The sheriff's office called Dustin's uncle, not us, when they suspended the active search. And Dustin's uncle called Dustin, and Dustin called me, and neither of us said much. I keep saying it, but it's the question that's owned me for 24 years, so I'll say it once more. Why Dustin? The deputies asked it. The 4 of us asked it across 100 late-night phone calls. Dustin had never been out to that camp before in his life, so it wasn't history. My best theory, and the lead investigator told me before they wound down the search that he'd landed in the same place, is the scouting. On our 3rd day, Dustin had scouted that northwest drainage alone, following his gobbler, and he'd pushed farther up the far slope than any of us went all week. The far slope where the shots came from, inside of a mile from that first camp. I think Dustin walked too close to the man's home. I think he maybe walked through it, or near enough, without ever seeing it, the way you'd never see it unless you knew. And I think the man spent the next 3 days watching us, learning us, picking Dustin's gear out of our pile, and then, when Dustin came back to that drainage a second time, in camouflage carrying a gun, the man decided he was being hunted, and he corrected the situation. The trip ended us, as an outdoors group. That part of the synopsis of my own life is just true. Bo sold his tent that summer. Kyle, who'd grown up duck hunting, hasn't held a shotgun since. Dustin finished school and took a job in Houston, and I always believed, though he never said it, that the appeal of Houston was partly that it contained no pine trees worth mentioning. And I stopped. All of it. Hunting, fishing, camping. My dad never understood it and I never explained it. Some doors just close. That was the whole story, and it stayed the whole story. That's the part I have to prepare you for, because I know how these things are supposed to end. Somebody gets arrested. Somebody confesses. A name gets attached to the shape in the tree line and everybody gets to exhale. I waited for that ending for years. I'm still technically waiting. The case never closed, but it never went anywhere either. I called the parish sheriff's office every few months that first year, and I always got some version of the same conversation. Still open. Nothing new. We'll call you. The detective who'd worked it, a patient man named Broussard, who never once talked to me the way you talk to a college kid, retired in 2006, and I actually drove up and had coffee with him about a year after that, because I'd heard retired cops will sometimes tell you the things the badge wouldn't let them say. He didn't have a secret. That's what I learned over that coffee. He had the same hole I had. He told me the casings from the far slope were still in evidence, .270 caliber, and that the file had my description in it, the height, the shaved head, the tattoos up the neck, and that in 31 years of police work our case was one of 2 that still followed him around. He said y'all weren't his first. I'd stake my pension on it, and I don't believe y'all were his last. Then he stirred his coffee for a while and said the thing I think about most. He said, a man who can live out there that long doesn't get caught. He gets old, or he gets tired, or he moves. But he doesn't get caught because getting caught happens in town. There were rumors over the years. There are always rumors. In 2004, a bow hunter over near Corral Creek told a game warden somebody had been in his camp while he was on stand, food gone, gear gone through, nothing valuable taken. And when I heard that 1 second hand through Dustin's uncle, I didn't sleep for 2 nights, because nothing valuable taken is a sentence I understand better than most people alive. In 2009, there was supposedly a shot fired near a camp in Wynn Parish, eastern side of the forest, never confirmed, never solved, no suspect. Every few years I'd hear about some drifter arrested somewhere in central Louisiana, and I'd find the booking photo. And I've probably studied 40 of those photos over the years, hunting for tattoos coming up out of a collar, and it's never him. Or I should say, it's never been him yet, because I still look. My wife caught me doing it once, staring at a mugshot on my laptop at 1 in the morning, and I told her it was work. That's the closest I ever came to telling her. The trip ended us, as an outdoors group. Bo sold his tent that summer. Kyle, who'd grown up duck hunting, hasn't held a shotgun since. Dustin finished school and took a job in Houston, and I always believed, though he never said it, that the appeal of Houston was partly that it contained no pine trees worth mentioning. And I stopped. All of it. Hunting, fishing, camping. My dad never understood it, and I never explained it. Dustin and I talk maybe twice a year now. Christmas, birthdays. We don't bring it up much anymore, but a few years back he called me late, and I could tell he'd been drinking a little, and he asked me the question straight out for the first time in probably a decade. He said, "Travis, why me?" And I gave him my scouting theory, the one I gave you, because it's the best I have. And he was quiet for a minute, and then he said, "You know what gets me? It's not the shooting. The shooting was 3 seconds. What gets me is he picked my stuff. He stood in that cabin with all our stuff laid out, and he took my shells and my sleeping bag. He knew which bunk was mine." And I didn't have anything to say to that, because Dustin was right, and there's no theory that makes that part sit down. The shooting was violence. The choosing was something else, something slower, and the man did the choosing over days, in daylight, while we fished and laughed and made jokes about my boyfriend in the tree line. I've built him 100 biographies over the years. An escaped convict who went into the forest instead of across a state line. A veteran who came home to central Louisiana and couldn't live under a roof anymore. Some local man everybody assumed had moved away. I've read everything there is to read about people who go feral in the national forests, and there's more of it than you'd want to know, and none of it has ever handed me his face. The tattoos are the detail that should have solved it. You'd think a tall man with tattoos running up his neck to his jaw would be known to somebody, remembered from a gas station, a jail intake, a church parking lot, something. Broussard thought so too. They ran that description through 3 parishes and got nothing. Either nobody had ever seen him indoors, or the people who had weren't saying. So here's where I have to leave you, and I apologize for it, but I promised you the truth at the start. I don't know who he was. I don't know if the shots were meant to kill Dustin or to run him off. And there are nights when the 8 inches of air between that first bullet and my friend's head feel intentional in one direction, and nights when they feel intentional in the other, and both kinds of night are bad. I don't know if he watched us drive out that last day from somewhere in the pines, and I'd bet everything I own that he did. And I don't know where he is now. He'd be old if he's alive. Broussard figured him for late 30s or 40s back then, which puts him past 60 now. and maybe he's dead in a thicket somewhere out there with nobody to find him, and the snare wires rusted through, and the whole thing ended years ago without anyone knowing it ended. But the Kisatchie is over 600,000 acres. I looked that number up once and wished I hadn't. 600,000 acres, and men still go out there every fall and pitch their camps and hang their bags and sleep with the tree line 40 yards off. And every single one of them believes the dark is empty, the same way I believed it. Right up until the second I raised my head from the edge of that clearing, and it wasn't. That's my ending. It's the only one I ever got. If some old part of your brain tells you the dark is looking back at you, don't let anyone laugh you out of it. Don't let them make it a joke, and don't help them do it the way I did. Because sometimes the dark is exactly what it looks like. Sometimes it's a man, and sometimes he never gets a name, and he never gets caught, and the last anybody ever knows of him is a groan from a cattle gate, footsteps on pine straw, and a stillness at the edge of the trees, watching, deciding, taking his time. Before I get into this, I want to make one thing clear. I'm not the type to jump at shadows. I spent 11 years doing overnight maintenance at a bottling plant, alone in a building the size of 3 football fields, and I never once got spooked. I've hunted since I was 8 years old. I've slept in the woods more nights than I can count. Whatever you want to call the feeling that crawls up the back of your neck when something is wrong. I thought I'd trained mine out of me a long time ago. I was wrong about that. What happened to me on those 40 acres in the spring and summer of 2011 put that feeling back into me permanently, and I've come to be grateful for it. That feeling saved my life. I'm writing all of this down now because the last person involved passed away recently, and I feel I can finally tell it in full without hurting anybody. Everything you're about to hear is true. I've changed the name of the town and the names of the people, but nothing else. Let me back up and give you the full picture. I grew up in Springfield, Missouri, raised mostly by my grandfather after my folks split. He had a little place out past Ava, maybe 15 acres of ridge and hollow, and every good memory I have from childhood happened on that land. Squirrel hunting in October, running trot lines in the creek, sitting on the porch while he told stories about the war. When he died in 2003, the family sold the place to cover his debts, and I never got over it. From that point forward, I had one goal in life, and that was to own my own piece of ground. Nothing fancy, just trees, water, and quiet, with my name on the deed. The problem was money. I made decent wages at the plant, but land around Springfield had gotten expensive, and I was a single guy with a truck payment. So I started going to tax auctions. If you've never been to one, here's how it works. When somebody stops paying property taxes for long enough, the county eventually seizes the land and sells it off on the courthouse steps to recover what's owed. Most of what comes up is junk. Landlocked slivers, drainage ditches, lots in dead subdivisions. But every so often a real piece of property slips through, usually because the owner died, and the heirs either didn't know about it or didn't care. I went to auctions for almost 2 years before my number came up. It was the 4th Monday of August, 2010, at the Ozark County Courthouse. Item 11 on the sheet was described as 40 acres, more or less, unimproved, off County Road 415, southeast of a little town I'll call Brant's Mill. The opening bid was the back taxes, which came to $2,200 and change. I'd done my homework the week before. I pulled the plat map, and the parcel was a clean rectangle with actual road frontage, which is rare at these things. There was a creek marked running through the northeast corner. The aerial photos showed mature timber over most of it, with one old clearing near the middle. The assessor's card said there had been a house on it at one time, but the improvement value had been zeroed out back in the 70s, which usually means the structure burned or fell in. I drove out and looked at it from the road, and all I could see was a rusted gate, a wall of cedar and oak, and a 2-track disappearing into the shade. It was beautiful. I figured I'd be bidding against half the county. Instead, When the clerk read the item, the whole crowd went quiet. One old boy in the back actually chuckled. I raised my hand at the opening number. The clerk looked around for a long moment, and then he banged his little gavel. Final price with fees came to $3,100, 40 acres. I remember standing on the courthouse steps afterward thinking I'd just pulled off the deal of the century, and wondering why nobody else had wanted it. I want you to hold on to that detail. Nobody else wanted it. In a county where hunting land regularly went for $2,000 an acre, a room full of local men let 40 acres with a creek go to an out-of-town stranger for the price of a used lawnmower. At the time, I told myself they just hadn't done their research. Country people are usually the ones telling city people not to be naive. That day, it went the other direction. There's a redemption period on tax sales in Missouri, so I couldn't fully take possession right away. The previous owner, or his heirs, had a window to pay the taxes and claw the land back. Nobody did. The paperwork finalized in March of 2011. The collector's deed showed up in my mailbox, and on the 9th of April 2011, I drove down to walk my land as its legal owner for the first time. I'll never forget that first day, though not for the reasons I expected. The gate at the road was the first thing. Like I said, I'd seen it from the county road the previous summer. It was an old tube gate, rusted orange, hanging crooked on a cedar post. Except now there was a chain on it. A new chain. Bright galvanized links, not a spot of rust on them, wrapped 3 times around the post, and locked with a brass padlock that still had the sheen of the hardware store on it. I stood there in the road holding my own brand new padlock, the one I'd bought that morning to put on my gate, and I tried to come up with an innocent explanation. Maybe the county had locked it during the sale process. Maybe a neighbor had been keeping 4-wheelers out as a favor to the dead owner. I got my bolt cutters out of the truck box, cut the chain, and hung my own lock in its place. Then I drove the 2-track in. The 2-track was another thing. 40 acres that had supposedly sat empty since the taxes stopped in 2004 should have had a driveway you couldn't find without a machete. This one was open. Grass grew up the middle, sure, but the wheel paths were bare dirt, packed hard, with the brush trimmed back on both sides. Somebody had been driving in and out of my property, and they'd been doing it regularly for years. About a quarter-mile in, the trees opened up into the old homestead clearing. The house was long gone, just a limestone foundation full of blackberry canes and a chimney standing by itself. There was a hand-dug well off to one side with a sheet of tin weighted down over it with rocks. A big walnut tree shaded the whole thing. If you'd shown me a photograph of that clearing, I'd have said it was the prettiest building spot in the county. Standing in it was different. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds, and I promised you at the start that I'm not a jumpy person. But standing in that clearing on a bright April morning, birds going in every direction, I had the strong and specific sense that I had walked into a room where somebody lived. Not a wild place, a kept place. The grass in the clearing was shorter than the grass along the 2-track. There was a fire ring near the old foundation, made of stacked creek rock, and when I crouched down and put my hand over the ashes, I could smell that they were recent. Days old, not years. Somebody had stacked a supply of split oak against the chimney, maybe a quarter cord, cut clean with a chainsaw. I stood up and turned in a slow circle, and I said loud that this was private property now, and I'd appreciate whoever was using it to come talk to me. Nothing answered but the birds. I told myself it was probably local kids with a party spot, or a squatter deer hunter who'd figured the land was abandoned. Both of those things happen all the time in the Ozarks. You post some signs, word gets around, and the problem solves itself. That's what I believed on the 9th of April. I spent the rest of that first day walking the perimeter with the plat map and a roll of orange flagging tape, and by the time the light started to go, I'd found 4 more things I couldn't explain. The first was the trail to the creek. From the back of the clearing, a footpath ran northeast down the slope toward the water. Not a deer trail. Deer trails wander and braid. This was a human path, worn to bare dirt. 18 inches wide, that went in a straight line to a spot on the creek where the flat rocks made a natural step down. Somebody had been walking to that creek, from that clearing, thousands of times. The second was the garden. West of the clearing, tucked behind a screen of cedars where you'd never see it unless you pushed through, there was a plot maybe 30 feet on a side. It had been turned that spring. The dirt was worked, raked, and rowed, and there were onion sets already coming up in a dead straight line. There was a fence around it made of woven sticks and salvaged field wire, built to keep rabbits out, and a scarecrow made from a flannel shirt stuffed with grass. The shirt was weathered but whole. I stood at the edge of that garden for a long time. The third was the snares. Along the creek bottom I found wire snares set on rabbit runs, 6 of them, all fresh, all placed by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. One had a rabbit in it, taken maybe that morning, still limber. The fourth thing I didn't understand until much later, and I'll get to it when we get there. At the far southwest corner of the property, the ground rose into a steep hillside covered in cedar blowdown from the ice storm of 2007. The whole hillside was a tangle of dead trees stacked shoulder high. I noticed, without really registering it, that a person could not walk onto that hillside if they wanted to, except that there was one low gap under the trunks near the base, and the leaves in front of that gap were packed down flat. I noted it, filed it under nothing, and walked on. That's the detail that still gets me. I stood 40 feet from the answer on the very first day, and I turned around and left. That evening, I nailed up posted signs along the road frontage, hung my lock on the gate, and drove the 2 hours home feeling pretty good about things. Whoever was squatting would see the signs in the fresh lock and move along. That's how it works. That's how it has always worked, everywhere I've ever hunted. I came back 2 weekends later, the 23rd of April, pulling a little 16-foot camper trailer I'd borrowed from a buddy at the plant. My intention was to camp on the place through the weekend, get a feel for where I wanted to build, and start cleaning up the clearing. I got there around 9 in the morning. My lock was gone. Not cut. Gone. In its place hung a brass padlock identical to the one I'd cut off 3 weeks earlier, chained 3 times around the post, the same way, in the same direction. For a second I genuinely wondered whether I'd dreamed cutting the first one. I cut the second lock, drove in, and set up the camper at the edge of the clearing under the walnut. Then I walked the place again. The fire ring had been used since my last visit. The wood pile against the chimney had been restocked. The rabbit snares along the creek had been moved to new runs. And on the flat limestone step of the old foundation, arranged in a neat row, were the pieces of my padlock. Whoever they were, they'd kept the lock I cut off their chain, carried it around for 2 weeks, and set it out where I would find it, cut into 3 pieces. I want to walk you through my thinking at that point because I know some of you are yelling at me already. I did consider calling the sheriff that day, but think about what I actually had. Some trespassing, a garden, a cut padlock, no threats, no face, no name. I was the new guy from Springfield, and I'd already gotten a taste of how the county felt about outsiders at that auction. I figured a deputy would drive out, shrug, tell me to post signs and leave. Mostly though, and I'll be honest about this, I was proud. It was my land. The first thing I'd ever really owned. I wasn't going to be run off it in the first month by somebody too much of a coward to talk to me face to face. So I stayed the night. And that was the first night I heard him. It started around 10. I was sitting outside the camper by my own fire, and the spring peepers down at the creek went quiet. If you spend time outdoors, you know what I mean. Frogs don't all hush at once for nothing. They hush in a wave, in the direction something is moving. I sat still and listened, and I heard footsteps in the leaves on the slope northeast of the clearing. Slow, even, unhurried. A man's weight and a man's rhythm, moving along the edge of the trees maybe 80 yards out, from my right to my left, in a half circle around my camp. I stood up and put my light out there. Big 4-cell flashlight, throws a beam 150 yards, nothing. Trees. The footsteps had stopped the instant the light came on. I called out that I could hear him, that this was my property, that I just wanted to talk. The woods gave me nothing back. I stood there with my light up until my arm shook, and the exact moment I clicked it off, one single footstep crunched in the leaves, and then nothing more for an hour. He was letting me know the light didn't scare him. I understand that now. That night I told myself it was a deer. At some point after midnight, the whistling started. Far off, down toward the creek, somebody was whistling a tune. 3 or 4 notes, rising, falling, over and over, unhurried and clear. I'd say it went on for 20 minutes. I sat inside the camper with the door locked and my deer rifle across my knees, listening to a grown man whistle in the dark on land I held the deed to, and I finally admitted to myself that I did not have a kids with a party spot problem. Morning came the way it always does, and daylight makes you brave and a little embarrassed. I walked the tree line where I'd heard the steps. The leaves were scuffed in a long arc, exactly where I'd placed the sound. On the 2-track, halfway between the clearing and the road, I found a message. Somebody had taken a stick and written in the dirt of the wheel path, in letters 2 feet tall, 3 words. It said, in block capitals, "This ain't yours." I photographed the deed in my head, so to speak, all the paper that said otherwise, and I got mad. Being scared and being mad live close together in a man, and mad won that morning. I scuffed the words out with my boot, drove into Brandt's Mill, and started asking questions. Brandt's Mill isn't much. A gas station, a co-op feed store, a diner called the Wagon Wheel, 2 churches, and maybe 300 people in and around it. I started at the co-op because I needed T-posts anyway. The man behind the counter was in his 60s, friendly enough, and when I told him I'd bought the old place off County Road 415, his face did something I've thought about many times since. It didn't get unfriendly. It went still, and it stayed still. He said, "The Melner place," not as a question, and then he counted out my change without another word. The Wagon Wheel did better by me. I ordered lunch, sat at the counter, and made conversation with the waitress, a talkative lady around 70, whose name tag said Doris. When I told her which property I'd bought, she stopped wiping the counter, looked at me a moment, and asked whether anybody at that auction had bothered to tell me anything. I said no, and she seemed to take that as a personal failing of the whole county, and sat down across from me on her break. Here's the history I got from Doris, from the county recorder's office over the following week, and from 2 other locals, stitched together into one account. The land had belonged to the Melner family for over 100 years. The old house in my clearing was built by the grandfather. By the 60s, the property had come down to 2 brothers, Carl and Aldous Melner. Carl was the older, considered normal enough, worked at the sawmill in town. Aldous, who everybody called Aldi, was the younger by 6 years, and by every account I could gather, there was something badly wrong in him from childhood. Not slow. People were careful to say that. Wrong. He hurt animals. He watched houses at night. Girls in town had learned not to walk home alone if Aldi Melner was known to be around. He'd done a stretch in the state hospital in Nevada, Missouri, in the 60s, back when they still did that, and had come home worse, in Doris's words, not better. In 1971, the Melner farmhouse burned down in the night. The mother died in the fire. The fire marshal called it a wood stove accident, but Doris said there wasn't a person in the county who believed Aldi hadn't done it, including his own brother. There was no proof. There never was with Aldi. That was the phrase Doris used, and I heard the same phrase, word for word, from an old man at the gas station 2 weeks later. There never was, with Aldi. After the fire, Carl moved into a house in town, and Aldi stayed on the land. This is the part I need you to pay attention to. Aldi Melner lived on that property, alone, without a house, for over 20 years. People saw his fires from the road. Hunters who wandered onto Melner ground came out shaken, and wouldn't say much beyond that they wouldn't be going back. A trapper who ran the creek in the 80s told people that Aldi had a dwelling out there somewhere, dug into the ground that you could walk past a dozen times and never see. Kids in Brant's Mill grew up warned about him, and no parent ever told them he wasn't real. They told them where his land started. Then, in 1994, Aldi disappeared. The story in town was that he and Carl had a falling out over money, and Aldi went off to Arkansas, or Texas, or nowhere in particular. After a stretch of years with no word, Carl went to the court and had his brother declared legally dead. Doris told me the whole town breathed easier for a decade. Carl kept paying the taxes on the family ground until he died of a heart attack in 2004. He had no children. No will surfaced. The taxes stopped. The county's clock started ticking. And 7 years later, a maintenance man from Springfield raised his hand on the courthouse steps and bought the whole story for $3,100. I asked Doris the obvious question. If Aldi Melner left in '94 and was declared dead, why did every person in Brant's Mill still treat that land as owned? She looked at me for a while before she answered. Then she said that in the 17 years since Aldi supposedly left, no dog in the houses along County Road 415 had ever stopped barking at that tree line. She said hunters still wouldn't go past the creek. She said that 2 years back, a young man doing survey work for the Power Cooperative had walked into those woods with his equipment and come out at a dead run and quit the job that week and never told anybody what he saw. And she said that if I had any sense, I'd resell the parcel to one of the cattle operations, take my profit, and thank God for it. I didn't take her advice. You already know I didn't, or there'd be no story. But I wanted on the record that Doris tried, and she was right. And years later, I drove down and told her so, and she cried a little and charged me for the pie anyway. I did go to the sheriff after that, for whatever it's worth. The Ozark County Sheriff's Department in 2011 consisted of the sheriff himself, 4 deputies, and a jail with 6 beds, covering 700 square miles of some of the roughest country in Missouri. The deputy who took my complaint was polite and completely unsurprised. When I said the name Melner, he wrote it down without asking me to spell it. He told me that legally, Aldous Melner was a dead man, and that whoever was trespassing on my land, be it a squatter, a poacher, or a ghost, my remedies were signs, locks, and patience. He said a car would swing by when they could. He also said as I was leaving, and I believe he meant it kindly, that I ought not to camp out there alone. Through May, I settled into a routine. I'd drive down every second weekend, sometimes with my buddy Ray from the plant, and we'd work on the place, brush hogging the clearing, graveling the worst of the 2-track. I had a builder come out and quote me a slab for a cabin, and every single visit, without exception, the property told me he'd been there in between. Some of it was housekeeping, if you can believe that. The grass around the old foundation stayed trimmed whether I trimmed it or not. The woodpile against the chimney never shrank. His garden, which I decided to leave alone as a sort of one-sided peace offering, grew up green and orderly, beans climbing the stick fence, and I'd be lying if I said part of me didn't respect it. Some of it was surveillance. I'd find where he'd stood. That sounds strange, but when a man stands in one spot in the woods for hours, he leaves a signature. Flattened leaves, heel divots, a worn patch on the sapling he leaned against. I found those stands all around my campsite, at 60, 80, 100 yards, each one positioned behind cover with a clean line of sight to the camper. I counted 9 of them by June. He watched me the entire time I was there, every visit, and he was good enough that in all those weekends I never saw him once. Let me say that plainly. From April to July, I never laid eyes on him. I only ever saw where he'd been, and nothing more. And some of it, more of it as the weeks went on, was message. The second weekend of May, I brought down a pallet of concrete block for the well house I planned to build, and stacked it by the foundation. When I came back 2 weeks later, the stack had been taken down and rebuilt into a low ring around the old fire pit, block by block, 80-pound lifts, square and true. Sitting on top of the ring was the skull of a cow, bleached white, with a river stone set in each eye socket. The first weekend of June, I found the message that came closest to running me off. I'd hired the builder, signed his quote, and he'd sent a kid out during the week to drive grade stakes for the cabin slab. Every one of those stakes, 22 of them, had been pulled, and they were waiting for me on the limestone step of the old foundation, arranged in the shape of a coffin. I'm not embellishing that. 22 grade stakes laid out in the outline of a coffin, sized for a man, with the orange flag ribbons folded neatly underneath. The builder's kid must have seen it too, or seen something, because the builder called me that Monday and gave me back my deposit. He didn't offer much of a reason. He was booked up, he said, for the foreseeable future. His voice had the same closed door in it that the co-op man's face had. Then there was the spring. Along with the creek, the property had a small spring that seeped out of the hillside near the clearing, and one of my first projects had been cleaning out the old spring box, a concrete basin the Melners had poured decades ago, so I'd have good water while I camped. I babied that spring box, screened it, scrubbed it, kept a cup hanging on a nail beside it. The third weekend of June, I hiked up to it in the morning to fill my jug, and floating in the basin was a dead raccoon. It hadn't wandered in and drowned. It had been opened up, and it had been placed on its back, with its front paws folded across its chest. The smell reached me before the sight did. I never drank from that spring again, and to this day I can't put a canteen to my mouth in the woods without smelling it first and thinking of him. Ray stopped coming down after the raccoon. He didn't dress it up. He said the place felt occupied, said his wife had asked him to quit going, and he shook my hand in the plant parking lot and held it a beat longer than he needed to. He asked me to think hard about what exactly I was defending. 40 acres of trees, he said, against a man who had nothing else in the world and nothing to lose, and who'd had 17 years of practice being dead. That was the clearest anybody ever put it, and I heard it, and I went back down anyway. I've spent a lot of years since asking myself why. The honest answer is the ugliest one. It had stopped being about the land. It was about being beaten. Somewhere in those months, the two of us had gotten locked into something old and stupid, a contest over territory between two males, and everything in me that came down from 10,000 years of stubborn hill people refused to be the one who yielded. He must have felt the same. Neither of us could see the cliff we were walking each other toward. Or maybe he could. Maybe he'd walked other men toward it before. By July, I believe he was done trying to scare me off. I believe the messages stopped being warnings and started being preparations, and I missed the change entirely. Here's what I mean. The nights got quiet. Through the spring, every night I camped, there'd been something. The footsteps, the whistling, once a soft, patient knocking on a hollow tree across the clearing that went on past 2 a.m. In July, all of it stopped. 3 visits in a row, the woods gave me nothing. The stands where he watched from grew over. The garden went untended, beans hanging heavy and unpicked, and weeds coming up the rows for the first time. To my eye, it read as surrender. He'd seen I wouldn't quit, and he'd finally drifted off to wherever dead men drift. I actually celebrated. I sat by my fire on the night of the 9th of July, drinking a beer, feeling that I'd finally won a long, hard thing. I know now that the quiet meant he'd stopped living out ahead of me where I could read him, and had pulled back to the one place on that property I'd never looked. He wasn't gone. He was waiting to see whether I'd have the bad sense to come find him. And on the morning of the 23rd of July, 2011, that's exactly the bad sense I had. It was a Saturday, forecast to hit 100 degrees, and I decided to spend the cool hours walking the Southwest 12, the one corner of the property I still didn't know well. That's the steep hillside I mentioned at the beginning, the one buried in cedar blowdown from the ice storm. My thought was to figure out whether any of the downed timber was worth salvaging for lumber before it rotted. I left camp at 6 a.m. with a water jug, a machete, and because habits die hard, my grandfather's old lever-action carbine slung on my back. That rifle habit is one of 2 reasons I'm alive. The other one is a rabbit. I worked my way along the base of the hillside for an hour, marking cedar trunks with flagging tape. It was slow, sweaty, thorny work, and my mind was fully on lumber when a cottontail broke cover practically under my boot and shot along the base of the slope. Without thinking anything at all, my eyes followed it. The rabbit ran 30 yards and vanished into a low gap under the stacked trunks. The same gap I'd noticed in April, the one with the leaves packed flat in front of it. Except in April, I'd been 40 feet away and incurious. Now I was 10 feet away, and I could see what the gap actually was. The trunks over it weren't windfall, they'd been placed. Notched and stacked, wilderness masonry, with brush wired on top, and the gap at the base wasn't a gap. It was a doorway, cut square, framed in cedar posts gone gray, and hanging in that doorway, pushed aside just enough for a rabbit, was a door made of rough planks, faced on the outside with bark so that shut, it would disappear into the hillside completely. I stood in front of that door for a long time. Every sensible cell in my body lined up and voted to walk away, drive to town, and hand the whole thing to the sheriff. I have replayed the moment more times than I can count, and in the replay I always turn around. In life, I told myself the quiet weeks meant it was abandoned, that I was only going to look, that a landowner had a right to know what was on his ground. I put my hand on that bark-faced door, and I pulled it open, and I stepped down into the dark of Aldi Melner's house. The first thing that reached me was the smell. Cold earth, wood smoke, tallow, and under all of it a human smell, the smell of an occupied den. 3 steps cut into the clay led down, and then the ceiling opened up and I was standing in a room. I want to describe this carefully, because when the story finally hit the papers, they called it a hole in the ground. And that isn't fair to what the man built. It was a dugout in the old style, the kind the first settlers wintered in, except he'd had 4 decades to perfect his. The main room was maybe 12 feet by 16, shored with cedar posts and oak beams, walls faced with flat creek rock laid dry. The floor was packed clay, swept. There was a stove made from a barrel with its pipe running up through the hillside, and I understood then why nobody ever saw smoke. The pipe elbowed sideways through 10 feet of rock and brush before it reached open air, and he only ever burned bone-dry oak. There was a rope bed with wool blankets folded at the foot, military style. Shelves cut into the walls held mason jars by the 100, beans, tomatoes, rendered fat, smoked meat. There were tools on pegs, every one of them clean and oiled. A shelf of swollen paperback westerns. A kerosene lamp with a polished chimney. And down a short dog-leg passage, there was a second room, and the second room is the one I still see when I close my eyes at night. The second room was his museum. That's the only word I have for it. Shelves floor to ceiling on 3 sides, and every shelf held belongings. Not his. A rabbit-lined denim jacket folded. A woman's purse, cracked leather, sitting upright with the strap coiled around it. A hard hat with a Power Cooperative sticker on the brim. Eyeglasses, 5 or 6 pairs, arranged by size. A child's shoe, single, white gone gray, displayed on a shelf by itself, with a river stone set on either side of it, the same arrangement as the stones in the cowskull's eyes. And I understood that everything in this room was displayed, curated, honored in whatever order that man's mind kept. On the near shelf at eye level sat a wallet. I opened it. The driver's license inside belonged to a man named Daniel R. Pruitt, born 1984, an address in Mountain Home, Arkansas. The license had expired in 2010. I stood there in a dead man's earth house holding a stranger's face in my hands, and my mind, which had been refusing all morning to accept the obvious, finally accepted it. The surveyor who came out of these woods running had been the lucky one. Others hadn't been. I was standing in the proof, and some of the proof had been down here waiting a very long time. And the newest thing in the room, the thing that hadn't gathered any dust at all, was on the bottom shelf nearest the door. It was my padlock. The first one, the one he'd cut into 3 pieces and returned to me on the foundation step. I'd left the pieces sitting there in April. He'd taken them back. My lock had been added to the collection, and it took me a second too long to understand what that meant, and I'll tell you what it meant. It meant the collection had already made room for me. Two things happened in the same breath. First, my whole body went cold in 100-degree July, crowned to boot soles. Second, out through the doorway and up the hill, clear in the morning air, I heard the one sound in the world I least wanted to hear. Down along the creek to the north, steady and unhurried and coming closer, a man was whistling. 3 or 4 notes rising and falling. The tune from the dark in April. I've been afraid before that day, and since, but only that once have I felt fear come up through me from the ground itself, through the soles of my feet, filling me from the bottom up. He was coming home, and I was inside, and there was one door. I made myself move. Up the clay steps, out through the plank door, pull it back to where the rabbit had left it, and I put the stacked hillside between me and the creek, and went straight up the slope through the cedar tangle. It was the worst possible ground to move quietly on. Dead branches everywhere, and I climbed it one careful limb at a time, sweat stinging my eyes, while below and behind me the whistling came up out of the creek bottom, crossed the flat, and stopped. It stopped hard, mid-note, and I knew, with total certainty, that some sign I'd left. A scuffed leaf, the door an inch off true, my boot smell hanging in the doorway of his home, had just told Aldi Melner everything. The silence that followed was worse than any sound I've ever heard. I got behind a windfall root wad near the top of the slope and put my back against it and got the carbine off my shoulder, and I listened to a quiet so complete I could hear my own pulse in it. He didn't call out. He didn't crash around. For 10 minutes the woods gave me nothing at all, and I began, insanely, to hope. And then a crow flushed cursing out of the timber 100 yards to my west, upslope, above me, between me and the direction of my camp. He hadn't followed my trail. He didn't need to. He'd lived on those 40 acres since before I was born, and he'd simply walked around, up the easy face of the hill, to get above me and cut me off from my truck. I was 31 years old and strong, and none of that mattered even a little. On that ground, in that timber, I was the visitor, and I was being handled by the owner. What saved me over the next hours, and I want to be straight that it was luck and not craft, was the ice storm. That hillside of stacked blowdown was the one piece of the property he couldn't move through any faster than I could, and I was already in the middle of it. I went sideways, east, on my belly under the trunks, moving when the wind moved the treetops, and freezing when it died. And it took me the length of the morning to cover what a man walks in 10 minutes. Twice in those hours I saw him. Understand, after 4 months of contest, those were the first times I ever saw him, and I saw him for maybe 4 seconds total, and that was enough for the rest of my life. He came through a gap in the cedars below me, moving across the slope with the low, sliding, economical gait of a man for whom walking in timber was the native condition. And every few steps he stopped and held still in a way I've never seen a human being hold still. He was tall and rangy, all cord and joint, gray hair tied back, dressed in earth-colored clothes gone soft with age, and he was carrying, low along his right leg, a long-handled tool that I first took for an axe, and later learned was a brush hook. He passed within 40 yards of me. His head never stopped its slow traverse. I lay under a cedar trunk with a round chambered and my heartbeat pounding in my throat, and I did not breathe, in the fullest meaning of those words, until he'd moved on down the slope and out of sight. You'll ask why I didn't shoot. People have asked me that for years. Usually people who've never pointed a rifle at a human being. I'll give you the 2 answers I have. The lawful answer is that a man walking on land he doesn't own carrying a farm tool isn't something you get to kill him for. And everything I knew that morning, the wallet, the shoe, the museum, was knowledge, and none of it was proof of anything a prosecutor could hold. The true answer is that I was praying, actually praying, that I would not have to find out whether I could. By early afternoon, I'd worked to the east edge of the blowdown, and there I made my second decision of the day that could have killed me, though this one at least had reasons behind it. My truck, my phone, and my keys were at camp, a half-mile north across open timber. The county road was a 1.5 miles south behind me, but the road was empty on Saturdays. and it was 8 miles of walking to the nearest occupied house. And I'd seen enough that morning to believe that Aldi Melner could take me on a road as easily as anywhere else, and would now, because he had to. The moment I'd opened that plank door, his 17 dead years and my 40 acres had stopped mattering. I knew about the second room. From here on, only one of us was leaving that county with what he knew. So I chose the truck. I waited out the afternoon under the root wad, soaked through with sweat, rationing a jug of warm water, and I watched him hunt me. That's what the balance of the day was. There's no other honest word. Twice more I heard him move a line across the hillside, patient, methodical, working the blowdown in ordered passes, back and forth, leaving no lane unchecked. Once, from a long way off, I heard the whistling again for a minute or two, and I understood it finally. It wasn't for himself, and it had never been a taunt exactly. It was for me. It was the sound a man makes to move deer along, to make the hidden thing lose its nerve and bolt. I chewed on my shirt collar and stayed put. Dark came a little after 9. There was no moon to speak of. I gave it another hour, and then I came out of the blowdown on my hands and knees and started north for camp. And the last long chapter of that day began. A half-mile of night timber, moving quietly, takes about 2 hours. I know because I've timed it since, on friendlier ground, trying to make peace with that night. It took me closer to 3, because every third step I stopped and listened, and because twice I heard, or believed I heard, movement pacing me off in the dark, and went to the ground and lay there with my face in the leaf litter for a quarter hour at a stretch. To this day, I can't tell you whether he was actually beside me for those stretches, or whether my mind had begun inventing him. I can tell you that the second time, whatever it was came close enough that I heard it breathe. One long, slow exhale through the nose, 10 yards out in the black, and then nothing. Possums don't breathe that big. Deer blow and stamp. Whatever stood there considered me for a moment and withdrew, and I lay in the leaves and thought about the child's shoe with the river stones beside it, and I bit down on my sleeve to keep my breathing quiet, and eventually I crawled on. I came up on the clearing from the south a little after 1 in the morning, and I lay at the edge of it a long time before I moved. The camper sat pale under the walnut. My truck sat next to it. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, moonless dark, dead still, and every hair on me stood up anyway, because the clearing felt exactly the way the whole property had felt on the very first morning. Occupied. But there was no choice in it. My keys hung inside the camper. I crossed the open grass at a fast walk, feeling watched the whole width of it, eased the camper door open, took the keys off the hook, and left everything else, wallet, phone, cooler, the works. 15 seconds later I was in the driver's seat with the door locked, and I turned the key, and the motor caught, and for one whole breath, I believed I was out of it. The truck rolled 6 feet and settled, front left corner first, then the rear, that sick sinking feel every driver knows. I didn't have to look. All 4. I found out later he'd opened the valve stems, no slashing, nothing so loud, just quietly let the air out of all 4 tires sometime during the day, and it told me 2 things. He'd known since morning that I'd have to come back to this clearing, and he'd wanted me to get in the truck, get the keys turned, get one taste of leaving, before I understood I wasn't going anywhere. The tires were the point. The truck was no longer my way home. It was a trap sitting in the middle of 40 acres of his ground, and I'd locked myself inside it. Headlights on a dead truck light the world for one man and blind the other. I understood that even then, so what I did instead was reach up and turn the dome light switch off, crack the door, and slide out into the grass on the far side from the camper. And it was in that exact second, with one boot on the ground, that the clearing lit up. He had a light. Of course he had a light. A big handheld spotlight, the kind that plugs into a battery, and where a man living in a dugout since the 90s got one is a question the investigators answered later, in a way I'll get to. The beam came from the tree line to the northeast, swung flat across the clearing, and hit the truck, and I went down into the grass, as the inside of the cab lit up white above me. The light held there. He thought I was in the truck. For as long as he thought that, I had a life, and I used it, crawling on my belly through the high grass at the clearing's edge, south, away from the beam, while behind me I heard him come out of the trees and cross toward the truck at an easy walk, in no hurry whatsoever, and that lack of hurry frightened me more than shouting ever could have. I made the tree line as the light went into the truck windows at close range, and I got up, and I ran. I ran the 2-track because it was the only ground I could cover fast in the dark, and I ran it hearing everything and seeing almost nothing, arms out ahead of my face, and behind me, after maybe 30 seconds, I heard one sound come across that clearing that I will carry to my grave. It wasn't a shout. There were never any words that whole night, that whole summer. It was the whistle, the same 3 or 4 notes, but fast now, hard-edged, twice through and done. It didn't sound frightened or angry. It was the whistle a man uses to send a dog. The gate was a 1/4 mile. My chain and lock were on it, and my keyring was in my fist, and I have relived the half-minute at that gate 1,000 times, hands shaking, sorting keys by feel in absolute blackness while the light came bobbing down the 2-track behind me, throwing my own huge shadow past me onto the road. I couldn't find the padlock key. I want to be honest about how close it was. The beam found me while I was still at the chain. My shadow jumped onto the gravel road ahead of me, hard and sharp, and I heard his feet coming, that long, sliding stride close, and I quit the lock and went over the gate, caught a boot on the top rail, and hit the county road on my shoulder and the side of my head. The next mile does not exist in my memory as a mile. It exists as pieces, gravel under my boots, and the sound of my own breath. His light swinging onto the road behind me and then off, and on, and off, as he came over the gate himself, an old man over a locked gate without breaking rhythm. The taste of blood where I'd bitten my cheek in the fall. The absolute knowledge that he was faster than me on this ground at night, 60-some years old and faster than me, and that the gap was closing, and that nobody on earth knew where I was. And then the hill, and the headlights. County Road 415 runs a long grade down to a low water crossing about a mile west of my gate, and as I came over the crest of that grade, the bottom of the hill lit up. A pickup was coming through the crossing toward me, headlights up the grade, and I ran down the middle of the road at those headlights, waving my arms and yelling with what breath I had left. The truck locked its brakes, and behind me, the spotlight simply went out. I've thought a lot about the man in that pickup, because it was 4 a.m, and what came down out of the dark at him was a bleeding, raving stranger with a rifle slung on his back, and he did not run me over or reach for anything. He rolled his window a hand's width down, listened to about 10 words of what I was yelling, and said, "Get in." He was a poultry farmer named Virgil, headed to his barns for early chores, and he had the county fire department's frequency and a radio in his truck. And by 4:40 in the morning, I was sitting on the sheriff's own porch, because in a county that size, that's where you get taken, drinking coffee with a blanket on my shoulders in July, telling everything twice. I'll compress the aftermath, though it ran on for years, because you've been patient, and you deserve the ending in a straight line. The sheriff took it seriously. Whatever I'd expected from my springtime visit to the deputy, the name Melner plus the words "second room" got me the sheriff himself, dressed and armed before 5. At first light there were 11 of them, deputies, the conservation agent, and the highway patrol, and I walked them to the hillside and stood back while they opened the plank door. The sheriff was underground for 6 minutes. When he came out, he didn't say anything for a while, and then he sent everybody who wasn't essential back to the road, and made 2 radio calls, and by afternoon my 40 acres had more law enforcement on it than Ozark County had seen in its history. They didn't find him, not that day, and not that month. The dugout was intact, the stove cold, and Aldi Melner was gone, and the second room told the investigators why he'd run rather than cleaned it out. There was too much of it to carry. I'll tell you what the state eventually established, most of it public record now. The belongings in that room were tied over the following 2 years to 5 people. Daniel Pruitt, the young surveyor's co-worker from the Power Cooperative crew, reported missing in the spring of 2009. His truck found abandoned 11 miles away on a forest road. A woman named Karen Odell, a botanist out of Fayetteville, missing since 1998, whose purse sat on that shelf with the strap coiled. A drifter known around the county in the 80s, never formally reported, identified by the denim jacket in the testimony of 3 older residents, and the child's shoe. I'm not going to write what the investigators concluded about the shoe. It's findable if you need to find it. I've chosen not to carry the details, and I'd suggest you make the same choice. The 5th person the room gave back was Carl Mellner, the brother. The heart attack in 2004 had been real enough. The coroner had signed it. But among the belongings underground were Carl's reading glasses, his pocket watch, and his church Bible, things his neighbors testified never left his person. And the working theory to this day is that Carl's heart quit while his dead brother stood in his kitchen in town, having walked 11 miles in the night because the taxes, or the land, or some ledger only Aldi kept, had come up short. There was never any proof. There never was with Aldi. They caught him on the 3rd of October, 2011, 71 days after that night. A cave, one of hundreds in that karst country, 4 miles southeast of my property line, where he'd wintered before, back in the years when he was learning to be dead. A trapper spotted smoke sign at the entrance and had the sense to back straight out and call it in. It took 9 officers, and he fought them at the end with the brush hook, silent the whole time. They all remarked on that, 68 years old and silent as they took him to the ground. Nobody died doing it, which I consider a miracle. He never spoke a word in custody, not to investigators, not to the psychiatrists, not to the judge. The court found him incompetent to stand trial, and Aldous Mellner went back to the state hospital system that had turned him loose in the 60s, and he stayed there under commitment while the missing persons cases were formally closed around him one by one, resolved by evidence rather than confession. He died there of pneumonia in February of 2019, and it was that death, finally, that let the family say things publicly. And that lets me write this now. As for the land, I sold it in 2012 to a cattle operation out of West Plains for a fair price at a closing where nobody made small talk. The buyer bulldozed the blowdown hillside and pushed the dugout in, filled it, and ran fence across it, and I'm told cows graze over it today and don't care. Before the sale closed, I drove down one last time. The state had released the property. The camper and truck were long since recovered, and I stood in the clearing under the walnut in the cold and made myself stay 10 minutes. The grass around the old foundation had grown up shaggy at last. The garden fence had fallen. The place felt, for the first time since the 9th of April, unclaimed. I took 2 things away from those 40 acres, and I'll leave you with them, because they're the whole reason I wrote this out. The first is practical. If you ever buy land at auction and the price seems impossible, and a room full of local men lets you have it without a fight, do not congratulate yourself. Buy the coffee, close the mouth, and ask them why. Every person in Brant's Mill knew something that spring, that I paid 4 months of my life and 30 years of good sleep to learn. The knowledge was free. It was sitting on a stool at the wagon wheel the whole time. All I had to do was ask before I bid instead of after. The second one is harder to say. I spent that spring and summer believing I was in a property dispute, because a property dispute was the size of problem my life had prepared me to imagine. The signs were all there from the first morning, the kept grass, the returned lock, the coffin of stakes, and I filed every one of them under smaller headings because the true heading was unthinkable. The middle of nowhere isn't empty. That's the mistake in the phrase itself. It's the one place left where something can stay, and keep house, and tend a garden, and grow old in perfect patience, for 17 years or 40, precisely because everyone agreed long ago to stop looking at it. There are more parcels going to auction every year. Somebody is standing on the courthouse steps right now, raising a hand, buying one for the price of a lawnmower. If that turns out to be you, walk every acre before you sleep there. Look hard at any hillside a person couldn't walk onto. And if you find a low gap in the timber with the leaves packed down flat in front of it, you leave it shut and you drive to town, and this one time, you let the county keep it secret. I promise you the deed isn't worth what's on the other side of that door. Thanks for listening, and stay safe out there. I want to say up front that I was the problem that night, at least at the start. I'm not going to pretend I was some innocent guy who wandered into something. I acted like an idiot, and then something happened to me in those woods that I still can't explain. And the two things are tangled together in a way that makes the story hard to tell. But I'm going to tell it anyway, because it's been almost 6 years, and I still can't be in the woods after dark. Not camping, not walking a trail at dusk, nothing. And people ask me why, and I always say some version of bad experience, and they let it go. You're getting the real version. This was late June, the summer I was 23. I was living in Lewistown, Pennsylvania, working at a distribution warehouse off Route 522, pulling second shift and hating most of it. My girlfriend at the time, Kayla, had family up near Beavertown, and every summer the volunteer fire company out that way put on a carnival. One of those small-town fire company carnivals. Funnel cake trailers, a Ferris wheel that looked older than my dad, a beer tent with plastic pitchers, and a raffle for a side of beef. If you've spent any time in central Pennsylvania, you know exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. The whole town shows up. Kids running around with glow necklaces, old guys in fire company t-shirts working the French fry stand. The carnival grounds sat on the edge of town, and behind them, past a gravel lot and a line of porta-johns, the ground sloped up into woods. Real woods. State game lands ran for miles back there, up over the ridge. I remember noticing that when we parked, actually. Kayla's cousin pointed up at the tree line and said the hunting back there was good. That's the only reason I registered it at all. So here's the part where I was the problem. I'd been drinking since about 4 in the afternoon. Started at Kayla's aunt's place before we even left, then kept going at the beer tent. And I wasn't a fun drunk back then. I know that now. Back then I thought I was fine, thought I was the life of the party, but really I got loud and then I got mean. And that night Kayla was talking to a guy she went to high school with, some guy named Travis or Trevor, and it was nothing. It was genuinely nothing. 2 people catching up at a carnival while I stood there holding a plastic cup. But 23-year-old me, 6 or 7 beers deep, decided it was something. I got loud. I said some things to her, right there by the ring toss, in front of her cousins, in front of strangers, in front of a whole line of families. Someone told me to calm down, and I told him where he could go. Kayla was crying. Her cousin got between us, and I remember shoving my cup into his chest, beer going everywhere, and saying something along the lines of, "Forget all of you," except that's not the word I used. And then I stormed off, not to the car. That would have required me admitting I needed the car keys, which Kayla had. No, I walked the other direction, past the porta-johns, across the gravel lot, and straight up into the tree line, because in my head I was making some kind of statement. I was going to disappear into the woods and cool off, and everyone was going to feel terrible and come looking for me. Nobody came looking for me. I want to describe what those first 20 minutes were like, because I think about them a lot. I went in angry, crashing through brush, not looking where I was going, muttering to myself. There was still daylight, but it was that late evening kind, maybe 8:30, 8:45, where the light comes in sideways and everything under the trees is already dim. I walked hard for a while, uphill, mostly. I remember stepping over a stone wall at some point, one of those old property walls that run through the woods out there, and thinking, and just continuing. The anger burned off the way it always did, fast and all at once, and left me standing in the middle of the woods feeling stupid. That's when I turned around to walk back, and I couldn't tell which way back was. I know how that sounds. I'd walked maybe 20, 25 minutes. How lost can you get in 25 minutes? The answer, if you're drunk and angry and paying zero attention, on a hillside where every direction looks identical, is completely. completely lost. I picked the direction I was pretty sure I'd come from, and walked 10 minutes, and hit nothing I recognized. No stone wall. I corrected, angled left, walked another 10. The light was going. Under the trees it goes faster than you think. I pulled out my phone. One of the older iPhones. Cracked screen, 17% battery, because of course it was. No service. Not one bar, not SOS, nothing. That part of the county is a dead zone even in town, and up on game lands, forget it. I held it over my head like that's ever worked for anyone in human history. Nothing. Okay. And here's where I made the decision that honestly wasn't a terrible decision. It might have been the only smart thing I did all night. I thought, the carnival has lights, big ones. The Ferris wheel alone was lit up with a few hundred bulbs, and there were floodlights over the whole grounds. Once it got fully dark, that glow was going to be visible through the trees, or at least against the sky. All I had to do was sit down, stop wandering in circles making it worse, wait for full dark, and then walk toward the glow. So that's what I did. I found a spot at the base of a big oak, sat down in the leaves, and waited for the woods to go black around me. If you've never sat alone in the woods while night comes in, I don't recommend it. It doesn't get dark all at once. It gets dark in layers. First you lose the color, then you lose the ground more than 10 feet out. Then the trees stop being trees and become shapes, and then the shapes join up, and then it's just black with a slightly less black sky above it. And the whole time the sound changes, the birds shut off, the bugs come up, and you start hearing things move. Deer probably, raccoons, whatever. I told myself that. But every snap out in that blackness went straight up my spine. I sobered up fast out there. Fear will do that. By the time it was fully dark, I'd have blown maybe a .02, and I felt every bit of where I was. And the plan worked, sort of. I stood up, turned in a slow circle, and there it was. Off to my right and downhill, through the trees, a dull orange-white stain on the sky. Not lights exactly, the glow of lights. Way farther off than I expected. I must have wandered a lot more than I thought during my correcting and recorrecting phase. But it was there, and it was unmistakable. And I remember this wave of relief so strong my legs almost went. I just had to walk toward it. Downhill, toward the glow, and eventually I'd pop out at the gravel lot and go find Kayla and start apologizing. I'd gone maybe 5 minutes toward the glow when I heard the first voice. A man's voice, off to my left, uphill, distant but clear, the way sound carries in the woods at night. He yelled one word. It sounded like there, or maybe where. One syllable, sharp and then quiet. I stopped. And my first reaction, I swear to you, was relief again. Someone's looking for me, I thought. Kayla told her uncles or somebody called the fire company. And they've got guys out here looking for the drunk idiot who walked into the game lands. That made total sense. Those fire company guys would do exactly that. So I almost yelled back. I had the breath in my chest to do it. I was about to shout over here into the dark. And then a second voice answered the first one, from a totally different direction. From downhill, from between me and the glow. And what the second voice yelled was, "Hey you, grab him!" I want to be really precise about this because it's the center of the whole thing. It wasn't "we've got him" or "he's over here" or anything you'd yell during a search for a missing person. Search parties yell your name. They yell hello and "can you hear us?" This guy yelled grab him, with this ugly excited edge on it, and the "hey you" part hit different too, because for one horrible second I thought he was yelling it at me, directly at me, that he could see me. That someone in that blackness had eyes on me. And then I heard laughing. At least, I think it was laughing. 2 or 3 voices, uphill, kind of whooping, and then crashing. Fast crashing, brush breaking, multiple sets of feet, and it was coming downhill in my direction. Every rational thought I had just left. I ran. I ran downhill toward the glow because that was the only direction that meant anything. and running full speed through woods in total darkness is something I hope none of you ever have to do. I couldn't see my own hands. Branches hit my face. I caught a limb across the forehead that put white sparks across my vision. I went down twice, hard, once catching my forearm on a rock, and both times I could hear them behind me. Not close, but not far. Voices calling to each other. At one point, one of them let out this long yell, and another one yelled something I couldn't make out, and then, clear as anything, he went down toward the light. They were talking about a he. They were talking about me. I have replayed that sentence probably 10,000 times. He went down toward the light, which means they knew where I was, which means at some point they'd seen me or heard me, and they were tracking me toward the carnival glow. And instead of yelling, "Hey man, are you the guy from the carnival? Everyone's looking for you," they were yelling, "Grab him," and whooping like it was a game. The crashing got closer on my left side. That's what made me stop running. I realized one of them had angled ahead of me, that the noise was coming from where I was headed, not where I'd been, and my body just took over, and I dropped. There was a deadfall right there, a big trunk down with its root ball torn up, and I got behind the root ball and pressed myself into the dirt and put both hands over my mouth. I was breathing so hard. That's the detail I remember most. Trying to slow my own lungs down with my hands clamped over my face, tasting dirt and blood because my lip was split somewhere in the falls. My forearm was hot and wet, and I lay there behind that root ball while a flashlight beam went through the trees maybe 40 feet away. A flashlight, not a phone light, a real one, strong, and it swept slow, left to right, then back. Whoever held it wasn't running anymore. He was walking, and the light was moving across the woods in this patient back and forth pattern, and behind the light I could hear him breathing and stepping through the leaves. He stopped. The light stopped. It was pointed maybe 20 feet to my right, holding still on a patch of trees, and everything went quiet. And this man said, at normal volume, almost conversational, "Come out." I didn't move. I don't think I've ever been that still in my life, before or since. My heartbeat was so loud in my own head that I genuinely worried about it. Somewhere farther off, one of the others yelled something, and the man near me yelled back, "Hold on," annoyed, the way you'd answer somebody interrupting you. And then he stood there for what was probably 90 seconds, and what felt like the rest of my life, sweeping that light in slow arcs. Then he made this sound, this little tss, through his teeth. Disgusted or amused, I couldn't tell. And the light swung away, and I listened to his footsteps move off uphill, back toward the others, and their voices got fainter and fainter, until the bugs filled back in over top of them. I stayed behind that root ball for a long time. I have no idea how long. Long enough that my legs cramped and I let them. When I finally moved, I didn't stand up. I crawled. I crawled downhill on my elbows and knees for a while before I trusted myself to crouch. And then I moved from tree to tree, stopping every few steps to listen. And the whole time that orange glow through the branches got stronger and stronger. And then I could see actual points of light instead of glow, actual bulbs, the top arc of the Ferris wheel turning above the tree line. And I have never in my life felt anything like what I felt seeing that wheel. I came out of the woods about 200 yards from where I went in, behind a row of campers where the ride operators stayed. I walked into the carnival lights with blood on my face, a soaked sleeve, leaves in my hair, and the first person who saw me was a woman working a lemonade stand, and I watched her take a step back from her own counter. Kayla found me about a minute later. She'd been looking for me for close to 3 hours. Here's the thing, and this is where it gets worse instead of better. She had told people. She'd told her uncles I stormed off into the tree line, and a couple of the fire company guys had gone up to the edge of the woods and called for me. Called for me, by name, from the edge. 2 guys, she said, and they came back after 20 minutes because nobody in their right mind goes deep into game lands at night for a drunk guy who'll probably walk out on his own. 2 guys, at the edge, calling my name. Whoever was up on that hillside with me, there were at least 3 of them. They were deep in the woods. They never once said my name, and they had a flashlight, and time, and a plan to get ahead of me. When I told the fire chief what happened, standing there by the first aid station while a lady cleaned out my forearm, he got quiet in a way I didn't like. He said there'd been trouble on the game lands that summer. He didn't say what kind. He said some guys party up on the ridge. There's an old logging cut up there where people go to shoot and drink, and sometimes they mess with people. That's the phrase he used. They mess with people. And then he looked at my face and my arm and said, "You should file a report," in a voice that told me he didn't think it was messing around either. I did file a report. A state trooper took it 2 days later, wrote everything down, asked me twice how much I'd had to drink, and I never heard another word about it. I don't blame him. What was there to find? Voices in the dark on 9,000 acres of public land. So here's where I've landed after 6 years. And I'll be honest, I land somewhere different depending on the night. Maybe it was a prank. Drunk guys from the ridge who heard somebody thrashing around in the dark and decided to terrify him for fun. Whooping and yelling grab him because scaring a stranger in the woods is hilarious when you're 22 and hammered. That's the version I tell myself in daylight. And most days I can almost buy it. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they were chasing a buddy of theirs, some game they were playing up there, and grab him was never about me at all. And the flashlight guy saying "come out" was him looking for his friend. Except the friend never turned up in that story. Except he went down toward the light fits one person on that hillside, and it wasn't their buddy. And then there's the third version, the one that shows up at 3 in the morning. The version where a lone guy, obviously drunk, obviously lost, stumbles into the dark 200 yards from a crowd of 600 people, and somebody out there sees an opportunity, where "grab him" meant exactly what it sounded like, where the only reason I'm here typing this is a torn up root ball and 90 seconds of not breathing. I never found out. That's the truth of it. There's no reveal coming, no news story I stumbled on later that explained everything. I looked, believe me. I searched arrest records for that county for a year. Nothing ever surfaced. Whoever they were, they walked off that ridge and back into their lives. And I walked into mine. And the only thing that connects us is that hillside and that one sentence. Kayla and I didn't last, and that was my fault too. Though I'd like to think I'd already started becoming a different guy that night. I quit drinking 2 years later, been sober since. When I finally told the whole story in a meeting, a guy came up to me after and said the woods probably saved my life twice, once from them and once from myself, and I think about that a lot. But here's what I actually carry day to day. I can't be in the woods after dark. I've tried. Friends invited me camping 4 years ago and I made it until sunset, and then sat in my locked car until morning while everyone slept in tents, and I never explained why. It's not the dark itself. I'm fine in a dark house, a dark street. It's specifically trees at night. It's the way sound moves through them, because every single time, some part of my brain is waiting to hear a voice out in that blackness. A voice with an ugly, excited edge on it, yelling about me in the third person. "Hey you, grab him." I walked toward the lights and I got out, and that's the ending, that's the whole ending. But 6 years later there are still nights I lie awake and understand, all the way down, that I only know how my part of the story ended. I never found out what theirs was supposed to be. Tonight's stories come from two experienced truck drivers, men who had spent years learning how to stay safe on the road and believed they could recognize trouble before it reached them. In our first story, an owner-operator leaves a crowded truck stop in El Paso after a brief encounter with a stranger. But as he travels deeper into the empty West Texas desert, small details begin to feel wrong. Each one has a perfectly reasonable explanation, until he realizes that the greatest danger on the highway may be much closer than it appears. Then, in our second story, a veteran trucker spends the night in an isolated overflow lot outside Amarillo. During the night, he hears something near his tractor, but by morning, everything seems normal. However, one routine habit, a habit other drivers have mocked him for, prevents him from making a mistake he would have carried with him for the rest of his life. Both of these drivers had years of experience, both followed rules designed to keep them alive, and both discovered that sometimes the most terrifying threats are the ones waiting just outside your field of view. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story. You can also follow the Just Creepy podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, leaving a rating or review is one of the best ways to help the show grow and reach more listeners. Now, turn down the lights, lock your doors, and settle in. My name doesn't matter much for this. What matters is that I've been an owner-operator for 11 years. I run a 2015 Kenworth with a 76-inch sleeper, and on the night this happened, I was hauling 44,000 pounds of aluminum coils out of El Paso, headed east on Interstate 10 toward a rolling mill outside of San Antonio. I want to say up front that I'm not the nervous type. You can't be, doing this job. I've had people bang on my door at 3 in the morning at rest areas outside of Gary, Indiana. I've had a guy try to climb my catwalk at a light in Memphis. I've been followed off an exit ramp in Louisiana by a car with no plates that turned around the second I pulled into a way station. 11 years of that teaches you a certain flatness. You lock your doors, you park under lights, you keep your head moving, and you don't make a story out of every strange thing you see, because if you did, you'd never sleep again. But I'm going to tell you about the night of October 9th. And I'm going to tell it in order, exactly the way it happened, because the order matters. Every single thing I noticed that night, I explained away in the moment, every one. And I want you to hear how reasonable each of those explanations sounded, so you understand how a careful man with 11 years behind the wheel ended up doing 70 miles an hour through West Texas with another human being breathing quietly 6 feet behind his head. First, the truck. This part is important. My sleeper has an exterior luggage compartment on the passenger side, down low, beneath the bunk. It's a storage box, basically. Big enough for a couple of duffel bags, my tire chains, a case of oil. The door on it is about 2 feet wide and maybe 18 inches tall, hinged at the bottom with a key latch. Back in August, somebody had pried at that latch in a lot outside of Tucson. They didn't get in, but they bent the mechanism, and I had it repaired at a shop in Phoenix. The repair was fine except for one thing. The latch didn't always catch. If you closed the door soft, it would look shut. It would even feel shut if you gave it a light tug. But it wasn't locked. You had to slam it. I knew this. I'd been slamming it for 2 months. I had a note on my phone that said "Get luggage latch fixed right," and it had been sitting there since Labor Day, because the door still technically closed, and I always have something more urgent to spend money on. Inside the sleeper, under the bunk, there's a panel between the mattress platform and that luggage compartment. It's a piece of pressed board, with insulation behind it, held in with plastic push fasteners. It separates the storage box from the interior. In most trucks, you'd never think about it. In mine, 2 of the fasteners had gone missing years ago, and the panel sat loose in its frame. You could pull the bottom edge towards you and see daylight through to the luggage box. I knew that too. I'd stuffed a moving blanket back there once and watched it slump through the gap. So, a luggage door that didn't always latch, and a loose panel behind it. Keep both of those in your head. I delivered a load in El Paso on the afternoon of the 9th and picked up the coils at a yard off Zaragoza Road around 5 in the evening. My appointment in San Antonio was for 10 the next morning, which gave me all night to run 550 miles. Easy. I planned to drive to Fort Stockton, sleep 6 or 7 hours, and roll in with time to spare. Before leaving town, I stopped at a big truck stop on the east side of El Paso to fuel, eat, and shower. If you've run Interstate 10 through there, you know the place. On a weeknight it's crowded, and that night it was worse than usual. Every fuel lane had a line. The lot was full and trucks were staged along the fence waiting for spots. Inside, the restaurant had a 20-minute wait and the shower list was 9 deep. Normal chaos. I fueled, moved the truck to a spot near the back of the lot, and walked in to put my name on the shower board. I was walking back out to wait in the truck when the woman in the pink sweatshirt came up to me. She was young, early 20s if I had to guess. Pink hooded sweatshirt, jeans, white sneakers that were clean, which I noticed because everything at a truck stop gets filthy and hers hadn't yet. She had a small backpack over one shoulder. No suitcase, no bags, no jacket even though the sun was down and the desert cools off fast in October. She stopped about 8 feet from me, which I remember thinking was polite spacing, and she asked if I was heading east. I said I was. She told me her boyfriend had left her there. She said they'd been driving to Van Horn. They got in a fight at the pumps, and he drove off with her phone still charging in the car. She said she'd been walking the lot for an hour asking drivers, and everybody kept saying no, and she just needed to get to Van Horn. It was only 2 hours. Her sister lived there, and she'd sit quiet and wouldn't touch anything. I want to describe how she said it, because this is the part I keep going back over. She wasn't crying. Her voice didn't shake. She told the whole thing in a smooth, even way, and when she got to the part about the boyfriend taking her phone, she looked off toward the interstate for a second, and then back at me. It was a good telling. It hit every point a true story would hit. And I remember a small, quiet flag going up in the back of my head. Not because anything was wrong with the story, but because nothing was. People who've actually been stranded tell it messy. They back up, they repeat things. They're angry at the wrong parts. Hers came out in order, front to back, and it landed on the ask at the end, clean and rehearsed. But honestly, that flag was faint, and it wasn't why I said no. I said no because I say no to everybody. My insurance doesn't cover passengers. My authority doesn't allow unauthorized riders, and 11 years has taught me that nothing good has ever once come from letting a stranger into my truck. It's the simplest rule I have. I told her I couldn't take riders, but that the store had security inside, and the manager could call the sheriff's office or a shelter service, and I'd walk in with her and get that going right then. I even took a step toward the building when I said it. And here's the second thing I keep going back over. The moment I said the word security, she was done with me. Not angry, not embarrassed, done. She said something under her breath, thanks anyway, or something in that shape, turned, and walked off between the fuel lanes at a pace that was faster than a stranded person walks. A stranded person with no phone and no ride has nowhere to be. She had somewhere to be. I stood there for a second, then went inside anyway and mentioned it to the guy at the fuel desk. Young woman, pink sweatshirt, asking drivers for rides, might need help, or might be working the lot. He nodded, and wrote nothing down, and that was about what I expected. Lot lizards, panhandlers, stranded people, runaways, they see all of it every night, and there's only so much a fuel clerk can do. I skipped the shower. The list was too long, and I wanted miles. I bought a sandwich and 2 coffees, one for now, and one for the road, walked back to my truck, did my usual walk around, and this is the detail that will bother me for the rest of my life. I checked the luggage compartment door on the walk around. I always do. I put my hand on it and gave it a tug, and it held, and I moved on to thumping my tires. It held. That's all a tug ever told me. I knew the latch was bad. I knew it needed a slam. I'd slammed it that morning in El Paso, after getting my chains out to move them for the scale, and I could not tell you, then or now, whether I slammed it hard enough. The tug said it was closed. The tug always said it was closed. I pulled out of the lot at 7:50 in the evening and got on Interstate 10 eastbound with about 550 miles between me and my delivery and a full dark coming down over the desert. East of El Paso, Interstate 10 empties out fast. You clear the city, you clear the outlet malls, and the last of the billboards, and then it's just you, the freight, and 80-some miles of nothing before Sierra Blanca, creosote flats, mountains sitting black against the last of the light, and a string of taillights ahead of you that thins out mile by mile until you can count them. I ran the first hour without incident, passed through the Border Patrol checkpoint east of town, got waved through, settled in at 67 with the cruise on. I had a talk radio station out of El Paso fading in and out, and when it finally dissolved into static somewhere around the Fort Hancock exits, I shut it off and rode quiet. I do a lot of my driving quiet. After enough years, the engine is the radio. Around 9 o'clock, I pulled into a little fuel station near Sierra Blanca. Not the big travel centers, one of the small independent places. I didn't need fuel. I needed the restroom, and my second coffee had gone cold, and there's a microwave in that store I've used before. In and out, 5 minutes. I was walking back across the lot with my coffee when I saw her. Pink sweatshirt, same backpack. She was standing at the edge of the lot near the air pumps, and she was talking to a man beside a white cargo van. I stopped walking. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. 88 miles from where she'd been stranded with no phone and no ride, and here she was, an hour and change later, standing in the dark at a fuel stop in Sierra Blanca. Somebody had given her that ride. Fine. Drivers say no all night until somebody says yes. But the man she was talking to didn't read as a good Samaritan dropping somebody off. He was older, 50s maybe, heavy set, and the two of them were standing close and talking low, and the van's engine was running, and nobody was saying goodbye. It read as two people having a work conversation. It read that way immediately, before I had any reason to think it. The van itself was nothing. White cargo van, the kind every plumber and parcel contractor in America drives. No lettering that I could see. Texas plates. I didn't get the number. Why would I? A woman I'd said no to had found a ride with somebody else, and none of it was my business. She never looked at me. I'm nearly sure of that. I was one more truck driver crossing one more lot, and she was turned mostly away, and I got in my cab and told myself the exact sentence I imagine you'd tell yourself. Small world on a big highway. There's one road out here. Everybody who left El Paso eastbound tonight is on it, and they're all stopping at the same 6 places. Of course I saw her again. That sentence is true, by the way. That's the poison in it. It's completely true. Interstate 10 funnels every soul in West Texas past the same handful of exits, and seeing the same car or the same person 2 or 3 times in a night is so common that drivers joke about it on the CB. The explanation was solid. I pulled out of Sierra Blanca, and I genuinely did not think about her again for 30 miles. I got to Van Horn a little after 10. Van Horn is the last real town for a long stretch, and every truck on Interstate 10 knows it, so the lots there stay busy deep into the night. The travel center I stopped at was slammed. Trucks doubled along the fence line, reefers droning, guys walking dogs in the fuel lights. I found a spot at the far edge of the lot, the dark end, backed against open desert, which at the time meant nothing to me except that it was the only hole left, and I was only stopping for a few minutes anyway. Here is exactly what I did in Van Horn, as close as I've been able to reconstruct it, and believe me, I have reconstructed it. I've walked through these few minutes hundreds of times. I set the brakes at 10:09. I know that from my ELD. I shut the engine off, took my keys, locked the driver's door with the fob, and walked to the building. That's about 150 yards, because of where I was parked. I used the restroom. I stood in line behind 2 other drivers and bought a large coffee and a pack of peppermints, the soft kind, which matters later. I paid cash. I walked back out. My receipt says 10:19. Call the whole thing 10 or 11 minutes. Most of it spent more than a football field away from my truck with my back to it, in a lot loud enough that you couldn't have heard a luggage door open and close. or slam, or anything else. When I got back, I did what I always do. Fob, handle, up the steps, quick look around the cab. Everything was where I'd left it. Doors had been locked. I'd felt the handle resist before the fob. My load was sealed and untouched. My tablet was on the dash, my cash envelope was in the door pocket, my jacket was on the passenger seat. Nothing stolen, nothing moved. I want to stop on that for 1 second. Nothing stolen. That's the whole checklist, isn't it? That's the entire security review a driver runs in his head at a truck stop. Did anybody take anything? Nobody had taken anything. It did not occur to me, standing in that lot in Van Horn, to run the other checklist. Did anybody leave anything? Did anybody add anything to this truck? There's no reason for that question to exist in your head. Trucks get robbed, trucks don't get donated to. I started the engine, let my air build, and pulled out of Van Horn at 10:26 in the evening, eastbound, with 118 miles of Interstate 10 between me and Fort Stockton, where I planned to shut down for the night. Say those two numbers to yourself. 10:26, 118 miles. The first thing I noticed was the passenger seat, and I noticed it almost immediately, within a mile or two of the on-ramp, and I explained it away in under 5 seconds. My passenger seat rides all the way back on its track. All the way. I keep my lunch cooler on the floor in front of it, and the seat has to be full rear for the cooler to fit, and that seat has not moved off full rear in years. Coming up through the gears out of Van Horn, I glanced over for my coffee, and the seat was wrong. Forward. Not a lot. 3-4 inches. Enough that the cooler was pinched at an angle against the seat base instead of sitting square. And my brain, without being asked, instantly said, the shop. I'd had the truck in for a service in El Paso 2 days before. Guys get in and out of your cab during a service. They slide seats to get at things. They never put anything back. That was my whole thought. Shop guys. I even felt a little flick of irritation at them. That specific mild annoyance you feel at somebody who moved your stuff. And then I let it go. What I did not do was think about whether that seat had been forward when I left El Paso that evening, whether it had been forward at Sierra Blanca. I couldn't tell you, because you don't look at things that are always the same. The seat had been invisible to me for years. I have no idea when it moved. I only know when I saw it. The second thing was the mint wrapper, and I found it maybe 20 miles out of Van Horn, in the dark, with my boot. I felt something crinkle under my heel on the floor by the pedals and reached down at a straightaway and picked it up. Cellophane wrapper, twisted at both ends, the kind that comes off a soft peppermint. Now, I had just bought a pack of soft peppermints in Van Horn. They were sitting unopened in my cup holder. Unopened. I turned that little wrapper over in my fingers at 70 miles an hour, and my brain served up the explanation smooth and instant. Same as it had been doing all night. You buy those mints all the time. That's an old wrapper. It slid out from under the seat when the shop guys moved it. It's your own trash from 3 weeks ago. I dropped it in my trash bag and drove on. And that explanation held right up until much later, when I had time to sit with the fact that I keep a clean floor, that I vacuum my cab every Sunday at the house, that I'd vacuumed it 4 days before, and that there was no 3-week-old wrapper riding around under my seat. Somebody had eaten a mint in my truck. Somebody nervous, waiting in the dark of a parking lot inside a stranger's cab, and had eaten a mint, and the wrapper had gotten away from her. The third thing was the curtain. Between my seats and my sleeper, there's a heavy blackout curtain on a track. I keep it tied halfway open when I drive. Always. Half open, tied with a bungee, so I can reach back for my cooler bag or a sweatshirt without stopping. It is one of those arrangements that has been the same for so long that it isn't a choice anymore. It's just the shape of the truck. Somewhere around Michigan Flat, out in that long, dead flat dark west of the mountains, I reached back for my hoodie because the night was getting cold, and my hand hit fabric where there should have been open air. The curtain was closed, all the way, corner to corner, and the bungee that holds it half open was off its hook. I pulled my hand back and looked at it in the mirror light, the closed curtain, and I sat with it a second longer than I'd sat with the seat or the wrapper. This one was harder. Shop guys hadn't done that. I'd driven 2 days since the shop with that curtain tied open. And then Interstate 10 itself handed me the explanation, because right about then I crossed one of those stretches where the pavement goes bad, that broken concrete that hammers the whole cab, and I thought, there it is. Rough road. The bungee let go somewhere back there. Curtain slid shut on its track. It's a curtain on rollers. Things move. I want to be honest about my state of mind at this point, because I've heard people tell stories where the narrator claims he knew, deep down, the whole time. I didn't know. I promise you I didn't. What I had at around 11 o'clock at night, 40 miles east of Van Horn, was a low hum. 3 small wrong things inside an hour, each one explained, and underneath the explanations this hum, this faint tax on my attention, that kept my eyes going to the mirror on the curtain more than they needed to. If the hum had a voice, it wasn't saying someone is in the truck. Nobody's brain says that. It was saying something dumber and quieter. It was saying, "You're off tonight. Drink your coffee." So I drank my coffee. And I drove into the dark toward Balmorhea with the curtain closed behind my head. And behind that curtain, on my bunk, under my own blanket, a woman in a pink sweatshirt lay on her back with a stun gun on her chest, breathing through her mouth, listening to me sip. The exits for Balmorhea come up around 65 miles east of Van Horn. There's a state park down that way with a big spring-fed pool, and in the daytime, that stretch has a little traffic peeling off toward the mountains. At 11:40 at night, it has nothing. The interstate rides a long grade through open country. The median goes wide and black, and for minutes at a time the only lights in the world are your own headlights, the marker lights of a truck a mile ahead, and one set of headlights hanging back in your mirrors. I mention that last part now, but the truth is, I hadn't given those headlights a single thought yet. They were just a vehicle, back maybe a quarter mile, holding pace. Vehicles hold pace with trucks all night long. People set their crews off a big truck's taillights on lonely roads, because it's easier than watching the lane lines. I've had cars follow me for 200 miles that way, and I never once met the driver. So no, I hadn't clocked the headlights. Not yet. What I clocked, a few miles west of the Balmorhea exits, was a sound behind the curtain. It was fabric. That's the only way I can put it. A short, sliding, fabric-on-fabric sound, half a second long, from the bunk. The exact sound a duffel bag makes when it slumps over, or a jacket makes sliding off a pile, or a blanket makes when the road shakes it loose from where it's bunched. The exact sound. And also the exact sound a person's sleeve makes when they move an arm that's gone numb from holding still too long. I called out, reflex mostly. I said, "Settle down back there," the way you'd talk to a load, the way drivers mutter at their own trucks all day. And I said it because I assumed a box had come off the bunk shelf. I keep a plastic tote up there with paperwork and a printer in it, and my honest first thought was that the rough road had walked that tote to the edge, and it was about to come down and dump my registration all over the floor. Nothing answered, obviously. Nothing was going to answer either way. A tote doesn't talk, and neither does a person hiding behind a curtain. So the silence after I spoke proved nothing, confirmed nothing, and I settled back into the seat and put my eyes on the road and let the hum in the back of my head get a little louder, and several minutes went by. I've thought a lot about those several minutes, because of what they must have been on her side of the curtain. Me calling out had to have stopped her heart. She had to lie there, 3 feet from the back of my seat, wondering if settle down back there meant I knew, wondering if I was reaching for something, working out what she'd do if the curtain flew open at 70 miles an hour. She held still through all of that, held still for minutes. And when a person holds that still, holds their whole body rigid and clamps down on their own breathing, there comes a point where the body overrules them and demands air. That's what I heard next. That's the sound that ended the night's explanations. It was an exhale. One long, controlled exhale, pushed out slow through a small opening, the way you breathe out when you're trying to make no sound and your lungs are burning. It came from the bunk, from low on the bunk, and it lasted maybe 3 seconds. And there is no tote, No jacket, no blanket, no piece of cargo on this earth that makes that sound. Air came out of a person behind me. My body understood it before my mind finished the sentence. I felt my scalp move. I felt my hands change their grip on the wheel without me telling them to. There was a human being in my sleeper. I want to slow the story down here, because everything that mattered happened in the next 2 or 3 minutes, inside my skull, at 70 miles an hour. And from the outside, absolutely nothing happened at all. The truck never wavered in its lane. The cruise stayed set. If you'd been driving alongside me, you'd have seen a trucker sitting still, one hand on the wheel, staring down the road. That stillness was the hardest physical thing I have ever done. Because every instinct you have is wrong in that moment, and I knew it, and I had to talk myself out of each one in turn. Instinct 1, turn around and rip the curtain open. Confront it. And then what? I'm doing 70 with 44,000 pounds of coiled aluminum behind me on a dark 2-lane each-way interstate. The second I turn in that seat, I'm not driving this truck. If whoever is back there has a knife, a gun, a bar, anything, I've just put my face a foot from it and taken my hands off the wheel. If they have nothing at all and they panic and grab me, we're off the road. And an off the road at that speed with coils is not an accident. It's an ending. Coils don't forgive. The load alone made fighting in the cab unthinkable. Instinct 2, slam on the brakes, bail out, run. Same problem in a different order. An emergency stop from 70 takes the better part of a football field even done right. And done panicked. With somebody coming over the seat at you, it doesn't get done right. And say I manage it. Say I get stopped on the shoulder and get out. Now I'm standing on the darkest stretch of Interstate 10 in Texas, alone, at midnight, with my truck, my load, and whoever this is. And I've just shown them their game is up, and I don't know what they do when the game is up. And there was something else, some early cold piece of my brain already asking a question I couldn't fully form yet. What if outside the truck is worse? What if outside the truck is exactly the point? Instinct 3, and this was the one that pulled at me hardest. Grab your phone and call 911. My phone was right there, mounted on the dash, big and bright, 4 feet from my hand, and angled the way I keep it, so I can see it from the driver's seat, which means it can be seen from behind the driver's seat. The curtain hung 18 inches behind my shoulder. If there was a gap in that curtain, if she was watching, then the moment that screen lit up with a dial pad, she'd know I knew. My one advantage, the only card I held, was that she believed I didn't know. Everything in her behavior said she was waiting. She'd been aboard for over an hour and done nothing. She was waiting for something, some place, some moment. And as long as she thought I was ignorant, she'd keep waiting. The phone would spend that advantage all at once and get me nothing for it for at least 20 minutes. Because I knew where I was, and where I was nowhere. The nearest deputy could be 40 miles from that stretch of road at midnight. I'd be alone with her from the moment she knew until the moment help arrived. And I'd be alone with her at whatever speed and in whatever ditch that knowledge produced. My tire thumper, for what it's worth, was behind the passenger seat. Might as well have been in Ohio. So I did nothing. I drove. And while I drove, I made an inventory, same as a walk-around, except this one was of the situation. What did I actually know? Someone was in my sleeper, on or under my bunk, behind a closed curtain. They'd been there since Van Horn at the latest, which meant they'd passed up an hour of chances to rob me or hurt me while I sat there oblivious, which meant robbery now, and hurt me now, were not the plan. They were quiet, and they were staying quiet. That's a person waiting for a location, not a moment. And the seat, the wrapper, the curtain, the latch I had to slam, the loose panel under the bunk that I'd known about for years. All of it snapped together at once, unforced, into one picture. The luggage door, the panel, the bunk. In through the box, push the panel, up under the blanket. 10 minutes in a dark corner of a busy lot, while I stood in line buying peppermints. My skin went cold in a new way when I got to the last piece, because the last piece was a pink sweatshirt in El Paso, asking me personally, by name of my truck, if not my body, for a ride east. She hadn't been working the lot. She'd been shopping it. And when I said no, I hadn't ended anything. I'd been selected anyway. Which meant the white van at Sierra Blanca was not a coincidence and never had been. And that thought sent my eyes, finally properly, to my mirrors, to the headlights that had been hanging a quarter-mile back for I honestly did not know how long, sitting there, holding pace. 2 low headlights with a wide-set spacing, van-shaped if you wanted them to be van-shaped, and I very much did not want them to be. I needed to do 2 things, and I needed to do both without moving anything above my elbows in a way that would look wrong from behind. I needed to get word out, and I needed to test the headlights. The word out came first, and it came from the one screen in my cab that faces away from the sleeper. My ELD, the electronic log tablet, sits low on the dash to the right of the wheel, angled up at my face, its back to the curtain. It logs my hours, and it messages my dispatch service. I run my authority through a small dispatch outfit, and there's a woman on their night desk. And that little message window had never in my life mattered until it was the only private square of light in my world. I've typed on that screen 10,000 times. Fuel receipts, load numbers, detention times. Drivers peck at their ELDs constantly. It's the most natural gesture in a cab. And I made myself do it exactly that way, casual, one finger, glancing down and back up to the road, down and back up, while my heart worked at twice its normal speed. It took me most of a mile to type it. I remember deciding the words needed to be short and could not be misread by a tired dispatcher as anything routine. Person hiding in my sleeper right now, not a joke. Contact police. Interstate 10 east near Balmorhea. Mile marker 209. Do not call my phone. Do not call the cab. Will signal by message only. I hit send, and I put my finger back on the wheel, and I looked at the dark road, and for the length of about 3 breaths, nothing in the universe happened. Then the little envelope icon blinked, and the reply came up in the corner of the screen, and I have never loved a human being I've never met the way I loved that night dispatcher. Received, calling now. Stay in motion. Message me every 10 minutes or I escalate. You are not alone. Now the test. My CB hangs from the header above the windshield, and the mic cord swings by my right shoulder. I don't talk on it much anymore. Hardly anybody does. But the radio was on low the way it always is. Channel 19 hissing along under the engine. And a CB has one property that made it perfect for what I needed. Everyone can hear it. The woman behind my curtain could hear every word I said into that mic. And if the van behind me had a radio on 19, and working vans that shadow trucks tend to, then the van could hear me too. I had a channel that broadcast straight into the ears of both people hunting me, and they both believed I didn't know they existed. You can do a lot with a thing that everyone trusts. I keyed up and put on the voice. Bored, half mumbled, the voice of a man talking to the night because the night is long. I called out to anybody eastbound, got a driver somewhere ahead of me who came back, and we did the usual nothing. Smoky reports, road work at Fort Stockton, how dead the radio's gotten. My voice held. I listened to it hold from somewhere outside my own body. And then I laid the bait in, lazy, right in the middle of the nothing. I said my eyes were getting heavy, and I wasn't going to fight it. There was a rest area coming up in a few miles, and I was going to bag it there for the night, catch the parking while it was there. The other driver said take it easy. I said the same. I let the mic hang back on its clip. There is a rest area on that stretch, east of the Balmorhea exits. I knew it well. And here is what I knew about it that made it the perfect bait. At midnight on a Tuesday, it is a nearly empty concrete island in an ocean of black desert. A handful of trucks, no attendant, no lights past the pavilions. If I were 2 people planning to take a truck and its driver somewhere quiet, I could not design a better place. A rest area announcement was an invitation, and only guilty ears would RSVP. I watched the mirror. For about half a minute, nothing. The headlights hung where they'd hung for an hour, a quarter-mile back, steady. Long enough that I started building the relief in my chest, started drafting the thought that maybe the van was just a van. Then the left headlights swung out. The pair of them slid into the passing lane and began to grow. No hurry to it, no drama. A vehicle changing lanes and picking up speed, and 100 vehicles had done that all night. Except this one grew until it was 200 yards back, then 100. And as it came up level with my trailer, I looked down through my window, and there it was. White cargo van, Texas plates. A shape at the wheel, heavy set, and I did not turn my head. I watched it in the glass, and with the edge of my eye, and the van ran alongside my drives for 3 or 4 seconds, right in the blind spot a professional would choose, and then pulled ahead and eased right, and its blinker came on for the rest area exit, 1 mile ahead. It went down the ramp. I watched its taillights sink into the dark of the rest area, positioning itself where it could watch the entrance, waiting for a Kenworth that had just told the whole radio it was coming to bed. I drove past that exit at 67 miles an hour, and I did not so much as lift my foot, and passing it felt enormous. The rest area lights slid by on my right and were gone, and somewhere behind my curtain a woman lay in the dark, doing the same thing I was doing, waiting to find out what I'd do next. As far as she knew, I'd simply changed my mind, which tired drivers do all the time. As far as I knew, I'd just confirmed that there were 2 of them, that they were coordinated, and that the plan had a shape now. She rides. I stop somewhere dark. The van closes in. And a truck full of aluminum and a driver full of blood go wherever trucks and drivers go when the industry news says the driver abandoned his vehicle. I messaged dispatch. Van took the bait at the rest area at mile marker 214. White cargo van, Texas plates. 2 of them working together. I am not stopping. Fort Stockton Police or Pecos County Sheriff, I will bring it to them. The reply came back inside a minute. Sheriff notified. They are coordinating. Continue to Fort Stockton. Do not stop for anything. They will be ready. And then there was nothing left to do but the hour. I want to try to give you that hour, and I know before I start that I'm going to fail, because nothing happened during it, and it was the longest span of time I have ever lived. 50-some miles of Interstate 10. The van reappeared in my mirrors within 10 minutes, hanging back at its quarter mile, and I understood that it would just keep doing that, patient, all night if it had to, because from their side, nothing had gone wrong yet. From their side, a tired driver had gotten a second wind. Fine. He'd stop eventually. Everybody stops eventually. Behind me the curtain stayed shut, and I drove with a passenger I could not see and could not forget for 1 second. Do you know what your own sleeper sounds like when you're listening to it? I do now. I know every tick my bunk frame makes over an expansion joint. I know the sound my blanket makes against the wall. Twice in that hour I heard her move, small settling sounds, weight shifting on the mattress, and both times every hair on my arm stood up and I had to run my eyes across my gauges one by one. Oil, pyro, air, fuel, naming them in my head, just to have somewhere to put my mind. Once, and only once, the curtain opened. It was maybe 40 minutes into the hour. I caught it in the edge of the mirror light, the left seam of the curtain easing back from the wall, less than an inch, a dark gap, and in the gap, low down, part of a hand. Fingers curled around the curtain's edge, and above the fingers a strip of cuff, pink. She held it there for a while. I will never know how long, because time had stopped meaning anything, but call it a minute. She was looking at me, at the back of my head, at the mirrors, at my phone glowing on its mount with its map running and nothing else, at a driver slouched and steady with one wrist hung over the wheel, checking her work. I gave her a man with no idea. I let my head nod a little with the road. I reached over slow and turned the CB volume 1 notch without a flicker in my face, and some while later, when I looked again, The seam was closed, and the hand was gone. A few minutes after that, my spare phone lit up inside the sleeper. I keep an old phone back there on a shelf by the bunk, plugged in as a backup. I'd forgotten it existed. What I saw was its glow, a soft square of light soaking through the curtain fabric low on the left side, on for half a minute, off, then on again a few minutes later. She'd found it. And she wasn't calling anybody, no voice ever came, so she was typing to the van, updating them. He's still driving, he's talking on the radio, he doesn't know anything. And the glow through the curtain, the light of my own phone being used to manage my own hunting, made me angrier than anything else in the whole night. Some cold, clean strip of anger that I was honestly glad to have, because it burned off the last of the shake in my hands. I used the CB one more time in that hour. I keyed up to nobody in particular and grumbled about my pyrometer running hot. Said I might have an exhaust leak. Said out loud to the empty channel that I'd have to get it looked at in Fort Stockton in the morning, and I guessed I'd limp it in and park at the truck stop there. Half of that was for her, so the destination made sense. Half was for the van, same reason. A truck stop in Fort Stockton was a fine place for their plan. Busy enough to enter, dark enough at the edges. Let them both spend the last 50 miles believing the night still belonged to them. Dispatch messaged at every interval, and I answered at every interval. And somewhere in the last 20 miles the messages changed tone. Deputies staged. When you reach town, proceed to the sheriff's complex on Highway 285. Do not slow before, they know your truck. Lay on your horn when you arrive and get out and walk. Do not look back at the cab. The lights of Fort Stockton came up out of the desert a few minutes after 1:30 in the morning, that low orange smear that towns make on the night sky out there, and I let the cruise off and came down through the gears on the long approach, and that's when she spoke to me. It was the first human voice from behind that curtain in 118 miles, and it was calm and unhurried and pitched the way you'd talk to a friend in the front seat. She said, "You missed your exit." The truck stop exit was sliding past on my right. She'd been following the signs through the gap in the curtain, or on my spare phone's map. She knew the plan I'd fed the radio, and I'd just driven past it, and she wanted to know why. And she decided the fastest way to find out was to stop being a stowaway and become a passenger. Easy as that, 3 feet behind my ear. I have been asked many times what I said back. I said nothing, not one word. I put my blinker on for the next exit, the business route into town, and took the ramp at a legal and reasonable speed. And in my mirrors, the white van came down the ramp after me with no quarter-mile left in it at all. Close now. Closing. Because a truck off its script had made them decide too, and everything everywhere was out of patience at the same time. The sheriff's complex sits off the highway on the south side, and I knew the building. I'd driven past it 100 times in 11 years and never once thought about it, and now it was the only place on the surface of the earth. She said something else behind me as I made the last turn, sharper this time, my name off my own permit book maybe, or just hey, 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 and I heard her weight come off the bunk, and I did not answer, and I did not turn around. I swung the truck into the complex lot wide and hard, right at the front of the building, right up over the painted lines, and I put my palm on the air horn, and I held it down. Held it. Set the parking brakes with the horn still roaring. Both valves, bang and bang, grabbed my keys, opened my door, and went down the steps in one motion, and I walked away from my own truck across that parking lot, on legs I couldn't feel, toward the glass doors, and the figures already coming out of them. And I did exactly what dispatch said. I did not look back. What I know from after, deputies came around both sides of that Kenworth within seconds. Weapons out, lights up, and they took her out of my sleeper without anyone getting hurt. She'd been headed over the seats when the horn went off and the world filled with cops, and she'd gone back and down instead, under the bunk, into the space behind the loose panel, and that's where they found her, along with her backpack. In the backpack were plastic restraints, a roll of tape, a stun gun, and my spare phone, still logged into a message thread with one other number. The van never even made it to me. A second set of deputies had it stopped at a fuel station on the edge of town within minutes, and the heavy-set man from Sierra Blanca was in cuffs before I'd finished saying my own name to the officer taking my statement. Over the weeks after, investigators tied the two of them to a string of jobs across 3 states. Trucks that vanished with their loads. Drivers who, the reports all said, had apparently walked away from their rigs and their careers and their lives at remote stops, abandoned their vehicles, and never turned up. 4 of those drivers have never turned up. I got my truck back after 2 days of processing. First thing I did was drive it to a shop and pay full price, no complaints, to have the luggage latch replaced, and that panel behind the bunk screwed down with steel fasteners, and I stood there and watched them do it. I still run Interstate 10. I ran it last month, but there's a stretch now, between Van Horn and Fort Stockton, where the radio stays off, and my eyes do a circuit they never used to do. Mirrors, curtain, mirrors, and I let myself remember it because I think I owe it that. 118 miles of desert, a man drinking his coffee, mumbling on his radio, nodding along with the road, keeping his voice flat and his hands still while his heart tried to break out of him. She had been 6 feet behind me for 118 miles. I have been driving tractor trailers for a little over 12 years, and I am one of those drivers who does the same walk around every single time I stop. I do not care if I have been parked for 10 hours or 10 minutes. Before I move the truck, I get out and look at it. I check the steer tires. I look beneath the engine for fresh leaks. I make sure nobody has pulled my 5th wheel release. I look at the airlines, the drive tires, the trailer tandems, the doors, and the seal. If it is dark, I do it with a flashlight. If it is raining, I do it in the rain. Other drivers have given me a hard time over it. I have been told I act like a driving school instructor. I have had guys laugh at me for checking a truck that had not moved since the night before. I never took it personally. Most of the drivers saying that had probably done the same thing when they were new. After enough years on the road, though, people start cutting corners. I understand why. You get tired. It is cold outside. Your appointment is already tight, and the truck beside you is parked so close that you can barely squeeze between the mirrors. Sometimes you just want to release the brakes and get moving. I am not going to pretend I never cut corners anywhere else. I have eaten things from truck stop hot cases that should probably have required a medical waiver. I have driven longer than I wanted because the next safe place to park was farther away than I expected. I have postponed showers, slept in dirty clothes, and convinced myself that a strange engine noise could wait until morning. The walk-around is the one thing I have always done. The reason goes back to something an instructor told me when I was getting my commercial license. He said a tractor trailer was too large for the driver to know what was around it without getting out and looking. That sounds obvious, but it stuck with me. From the driver's seat, you can see a lot. You have mirrors covering both sides. You sit high enough to look over most traffic. You have lights, cameras, alarms, and sensors. But there are places around a truck that are completely invisible from the cab. I found that out in Amarillo. This happened several winters ago. I was working for a medium-sized refrigerated carrier based in Arkansas, although I was pulling a dry van that week because the company had more dry freight than refrigerated loads. I had picked up mixed grocery freight from a warehouse on the west side of Albuquerque. It was going to a distribution center in Oklahoma City. The trailer was loaded fairly heavy, a little under 40,000 pounds, and the appointment was late the following morning. It should have been an easy run. I left Albuquerque in the afternoon, went east through the mountains, and crossed into Texas after dark. A cold front had moved through earlier that day. The roads were dry, but the temperature was dropping quickly, and the wind was strong enough to push at the side of the trailer. Anyone who has driven through the Texas Panhandle knows what that wind can be like. There is not much out there to slow it down. It comes across the open ground and catches the trailer like a sail. By the time I reached Amarillo, I had been correcting against it for hours. I was not falling asleep, but I was worn out in that way drivers understand. My shoulders hurt from holding the wheel. My eyes felt dry. I was hungry, and I had begun paying more attention to the clock on my electronic log than I was comfortable with. I had enough driving time left to continue beyond the city, but not enough to guarantee that I would find legal parking farther east. Every experienced driver has made that calculation. You can take the safe space you see now, or you can gamble on another one 50 miles down the road. I decided not to gamble. The first major truck stop I checked was full. Drivers were already parked along the entrance ramp and around the edges of the fuel island. The second place was not much better. I made one slow loop through the lot and saw 3 trucks waiting for one driver who appeared to be getting ready to leave. I kept going. On the east side of Amarillo, not far from the airport, I pulled into an older independent truck plaza on the frontage road beside Interstate 40. I am not going to name the place. What happened was not the truck stop's fault, and as far as I know, it has changed ownership since then anyway. The main lot was paved and fairly well lit. The overflow area behind it was another story. It was a broad section of cracked asphalt and packed dirt running behind the service building. A low-budget motel sat beyond a chain-link fence on one side. On the other side was an open field with dead winter grass and scattered trash caught along the fence. The overflow area had several light poles, but only about half of them worked. There were already close to 20 trucks back there. Some were lined up correctly. Others had made their own spaces wherever they could fit. A few bobtail tractors were parked along the motel fence, and there were several passenger vehicles mixed in with them. I found a pull-through space near the back. That mattered later. Instead of backing toward the fence, I was able to pull through between 2 rows and stop with my tractor facing east. When I left in the morning, I would only need to release the brakes and drive forward. There was a flatbed on my driver's side and an empty space on my passenger side. Beyond that space was a narrow lane leading toward the motel parking lot. I set the brakes, shut down the engine, and sat there for a minute listening to the wind push against the cab. It was a little after 1 in the morning. My company required a post-trip inspection at the end of the shift. Some drivers completed it from the seat and checked every box without looking at anything. I got out. The temperature was somewhere in the upper 20s, but the wind made it feel much colder. It cut through my sweatshirt before I had taken 3 steps. I walked around the front of the tractor and checked the passenger side steer tire. I looked beneath the engine with my flashlight. I checked the drive tires, the airlines, the fifth wheel, and the trailer. There was nobody beneath the truck. I want to make that clear. There was nothing beside the drive tires. There was nothing lying between the tractor and the trailer. I shined my flashlight directly through that area while looking at the airlines. I checked the trailer seal, entered the number into the company application, and took the required photograph. When I came back along the driver's side, a man was standing near my cab. I had not heard him approach because of the wind and the idling trucks around us. He looked to be in his mid-30s, although it was hard to tell in the poor lighting. He was thin and wore jeans, work boots, and a tan canvas jacket over a gray sweatshirt. He had no hat despite the cold. His hair was very short, and there was a dark mark near one side of his mouth. At first I thought it was a shadow. When he stepped closer to the light, I realized his lip was split. He asked if I was heading east. I said I was. He wanted to know how far. That is a question drivers hear all the time. Sometimes it is another driver asking about road conditions. Sometimes it is someone looking for a ride. Every company I have worked for has had strict rules against unauthorized passengers, and I would not have let a stranger into my truck regardless. I told him I was going to Oklahoma City, but could not take anyone with me. He said his brother had left him at the motel after an argument. According to him, his wallet and phone were both in his brother's pickup. He only needed to get as far as Oklahoma City, where he had family. I told him again that I could not help. He offered me $200. That was when I became uncomfortable. People who honestly need a ride usually do not lead with that much cash after claiming they have lost their wallet. I also noticed that he kept looking past me toward the motel. I followed his eyes. A dark pickup was parked near the far end of the motel building. Its headlights were off, but the engine appeared to be running. I could see exhaust moving through the cold air. The man said the money was in his jacket. He reached toward one of the pockets, but I stepped back and told him not to. I was not accusing him of having a weapon. I simply did not want him reaching into his clothing while standing that close to me in a dark parking lot. He stopped. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he asked when I planned to leave. I should not have answered. I know that now. At the time, I assumed he was deciding whether it was worth waiting around in case I changed my mind. I told him I would be leaving after my break, sometime around sunrise. The man looked toward the motel again. The pickup had begun moving. It rolled slowly through the motel lot without turning on its headlights. When it reached the opening in the fence, it turned into the truck overflow area. The man immediately walked away from me. He did not run. He just lowered his head and moved between two parked trailers toward the service building. The pickup continued in the same direction. It was an older, dark-colored crew cab truck. I could not see the license plate from where I stood. There appeared to be two people inside, but the windows were tinted. It passed behind my trailer and followed the lane the man had taken. I waited beside my tractor for another minute, expecting to hear an argument or see someone chasing him. Nothing happened. The pickup disappeared between the parked trucks. I considered going inside and telling the clerk, but I did not know what I would have reported. A man had asked me for a ride. A pickup had driven through a parking lot. That was it. I climbed into my cab, locked both doors, and pulled the curtains closed. The whole interaction had bothered me, but not enough to make me leave. That is another question people have asked since then. Why did I stay? The answer is that strange encounters happen at truck stops. Drivers see people arguing, asking for money, selling things, looking for rides, and wandering around at all hours. If I abandoned every parking space because someone made me uncomfortable, I would never complete a break. I also had very little time left on my driving clock. Moving to another truck stop could have put me in violation, and there was no guarantee another space would be available. So I stayed. I went into the service building to use the restroom and buy food. The place was old but clean enough. There was one clerk behind the counter and a maintenance employee mopping near the coffee station. I looked for the man in the tan jacket. He was not inside. I bought a microwaved sandwich, a bottle of water, and a cup of coffee I did not need. On my way back to the truck, I noticed the dark pickup parked beside the motel again. This time the engine was off. I could not see anyone inside. Back in the cab, I ate while checking messages from dispatch. My delivery appointment had not changed. The weather east of Amarillo looked clear. I sent my wife a message saying I had stopped for the night and would call after the delivery. Then I set my alarm and moved into the sleeper. I run an auxiliary power unit at night rather than idling the main engine. It cycles on and off depending on the temperature and battery level. When it shuts down, the cab can become surprisingly quiet. I remember lying there and hearing the wind rattle something against the trailer beside me. At some point I fell asleep. I do not know exactly when I woke up the first time. The clock on the sleeper wall said a little after 3, but I cannot say whether I had been awake for a few seconds or several minutes before looking at it. Something had bumped the truck. It was not a hard impact. The cab rocked once on its suspension, followed by a faint scraping sound beneath the sleeper. I stayed still and listened. Nothing followed. My first thought was that the flatbed driver beside me had opened a storage box and struck my tractor. My second thought was that someone was trying to steal fuel. Fuel theft was not as common there as it was in some places, but it happened. The caps on that truck did not lock, and a person with a hose and a few containers could take quite a bit before a sleeping driver noticed. I got out of the bunk and looked through a narrow gap in the curtain. The driver's side mirror showed the flatbed beside me. Its lights were off. There was no movement around it. I checked the passenger side. The empty parking space was still empty. Beyond it, the motel lot was mostly dark. I could see the pickup though. It was parked near the end of the motel building with its front pointed toward the truck lot. I watched for a while. Nobody moved around it. I thought about getting dressed and checking outside, but the temperature had dropped and the cab was still moving slightly in the wind. I decided the wind had shifted something beneath the trailer or pushed a piece of debris against the truck. I returned to the bunk. Several minutes later, the auxiliary power unit shut down. That was when I heard voices. They were low and close, somewhere behind the cab. I could not make out most of what was being said because of the wind and the insulation in the sleeper. Then one voice became clear. It said, "Get his arm in." There are certain sentences your brain tries to correct after you hear them. I told myself the man had said something about an alarm. Maybe the flatbed driver was helping another driver repair something. Maybe there were mechanics working between the trucks. I listened again. I heard a dragging sound, followed by a soft metallic knock beneath the floor. The truck moved on its suspension. I sat up and reached for my phone. There was no reason for anyone to be beneath my tractor at 3 in the morning. I considered calling 911, but I still did not know what was happening. I did not want to tell an emergency dispatcher that I had heard a noise under my truck and imagined a sentence through the wall. Instead, I turned on the exterior work lights. Those lights illuminated the back of the tractor and the area around the fifth wheel. From inside the cab, I watched the mirrors. For 1 second, I saw a shadow move across the passenger side light. Then it was gone. A vehicle door closed somewhere near the motel. The dark pickup's parking lights came on. It pulled away from the motel, crossed the overflow lot, and exited toward the frontage road. I never saw who got into it. The lot became quiet again. I waited with the lights on for close to 15 minutes. No one approached the truck. No one appeared in the mirrors. Eventually, I convinced myself that whoever had been outside was gone. I did not go back to sleep properly after that. I lay in the bunk with my phone beside me and listened to every noise. The wind pushed at the trailer. Air tanks discharged. Refrigeration units started and stopped. Drivers pulled out of spaces, their headlights moving through the curtains. Each sound seemed connected to the one beneath my cab. By around 5, the truck lot had begun waking up. Engines started in different rows. Drivers walked toward the service building carrying shower bags and coffee cups. The ordinary activity made me feel foolish. Whatever I had heard during the night seemed less threatening once other people were outside. My alarm went off shortly before 5:30. I got dressed, moved into the driver's seat, and checked the electronic log. I had completed my break. If I left within the next half hour, I would reach the receiver with enough time to fuel and still arrive early. I started the engine and let the air pressure build. This detail is important. I started the engine, but I did not release either brake. The yellow and red knobs remained pulled out. The tractor and trailer were still locked in place. While the engine warmed, I entered my route into the navigation system and completed the first part of the company's electronic inspection form. I remember being annoyed about having to get out. The cab was warm. Outside, the temperature was below freezing. The wind had not eased. I had already inspected the truck before going to sleep, and it had not moved. For maybe half a second, I considered checking the boxes from the seat. I had never done that before, but I considered it. Then I thought about the noise beneath the sleeper. I put on my coat, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed down. The sky was beginning to lighten, but the overflow lot was still mostly dark. A thin gray line sat along the eastern horizon. The light poles made the blowing dust and bits of trash look like they were moving through fog. I started at the front of the tractor. The hood was still latched. There were no fresh leaks beneath the engine. Both steer tires looked normal. I moved along the driver's side. The fuel cap was secure. Nothing appeared damaged around the steps or battery box. The flatbed beside me was still parked. Its curtains were closed, although the engine was idling. I walked between the back of my cab and the trailer, checking the airlines and fifth wheel. Everything was connected. When I reached the passenger side, my flashlight passed over something near the drive tires. At first, I thought it was an old work boot. Truck stop lots collect all kinds of trash. I have seen shoes, clothes, broken appliances, bottles, mattresses, and pieces of furniture abandoned beside parked trucks. The boot was lying on its side beneath the fuel tank. I moved the light farther inward. There was a leg attached to it. For a moment, I could not understand what I was seeing. A man was lying crosswise beneath the tractor. His legs extended under the frame toward the driver's side. His upper body was on the passenger side, directly in front of the first set of drive tires. One shoulder was pushed partly beneath the outer tire. The side of his head was less than a foot from the rubber. If the truck moved forward, the drive tires would pass over his upper body. The man was wearing jeans and a tan canvas jacket. It was the person who had asked me for a ride. His hands were secured behind his back with black plastic ties. Gray tape covered his mouth and wrapped around the back of his head. There was dried blood along one side of his face, much more than I had seen earlier. His eyes were closed. I stumbled backward and nearly dropped the flashlight. My first assumption was that he was dead. Then I saw his jacket move. It was a very small movement, but it matched the rhythm of breathing. I looked toward the motel. The dark pickup was gone. I looked around the truck lot. Several drivers were walking near the service building, but nobody was close enough to see what I had found. I crouched a few feet away from the man. I did not touch him. I was afraid his neck or back might be broken, and I did not know whether moving him would make things worse. I said that I was going to call for help. His eyelids moved, but he did not open them. I stood and dialed 911. The dispatcher asked for the address. I gave the name of the truck plaza and described the overflow lot. I explained that an injured man had been placed beneath my tractor and that the truck had not moved since the previous night. She asked whether the person was breathing. I said he was. She told me not to move him and not to move the truck. I remember looking through the gap between the drive tires and thinking there was no possibility of me moving it. The dispatcher asked whether anyone else was nearby. Before I could answer, I saw the dark pickup enter the motel driveway. It came from the frontage road with its headlights off. I told the dispatcher that the vehicle I had seen during the night had returned. She instructed me to get inside my cab, lock the doors, and remain on the phone. I climbed up the passenger side steps because they were closest. The moment I shut the door, I locked both sides. The pickup crossed through the opening in the fence and entered the overflow lot. It was moving faster than before. I shifted into the driver's seat and watched through the mirrors. The pickup drove behind my trailer and stopped at an angle, partly blocking the lane. Both front doors opened. 2 men got out. Neither of them was the man beneath the truck. The driver was broad and heavy-set, wearing a dark coat and a baseball cap. The passenger was thinner, with a hood pulled over his head. The heavy-set man walked toward my door. The thinner one went directly to the passenger side drive tires. That removed any doubt that they knew the injured man was there. I told the dispatcher what they were doing. She said officers were on the way and repeated that I should not leave the cab. The heavy-set man reached my door and pulled the handle. When it did not open, he struck the glass with the side of his hand. He pointed toward the ground beneath the tractor and shouted that there was someone under my truck. I already knew that. Then he pointed forward. He wanted me to move. At first, he acted as though he were trying to help. He made a rolling motion with both hands and pointed toward the front of the truck again. The thin man had crouched beside the drive tires. He reached beneath the tractor, grabbed the injured man by the back of his jacket, and pulled. The man's head moved closer to the tire. I leaned on the air horn. The sound filled the lot. The heavy-set man jumped away from the door. The thin man released the jacket and covered his ears. I held the horn for several seconds, stopped, and then sounded it again. Curtains opened in nearby trucks. Headlights came on. The driver in the flatbed beside me leaned toward his window. The heavy-set man began striking my door again. This time he was not pretending to help. He shouted that I had run over someone and needed to get out. The dispatcher could hear him through my phone. I told her the truck had not moved. The brakes were still set, and my electronic log showed I had been stationary all night. She told me not to argue with him and said officers were close. The thin man reached under the tractor again. He He pulled the injured man farther toward the tire. I sounded the horn until the air pressure began dropping. The heavy-set man moved away from my door and took out his phone. A few seconds later, the thin man stood and walked quickly toward the service building. I assumed he was leaving. He was not. He had called the truck stop. The overnight maintenance employee came out through a rear door carrying a flashlight. The thin man met him halfway and began pointing toward my tractor. The employee followed him. From inside the cab, I could not hear their conversation. I could see the thin man making frantic gestures. He pointed at the drive tires, then at me, then forward along the lane. The maintenance employee approached the passenger side and shined his flashlight beneath the truck. He saw the injured man. He immediately stepped back. The thin man moved beside him and made the same rolling gesture the heavy-set man had made. They wanted the employee to signal me forward. For a second, it appeared to work. The employee came around the front of the tractor and stood where I could see him through the windshield. He raised one arm and motioned for me to move ahead slowly. I shook my head. He signaled again. The two suspects had apparently told him that the man was trapped, and the truck needed to move before anyone could pull him out. I pointed down toward my brake knobs and yelled through the closed window that the man was alive and directly in front of the tires. The employee could not hear me over the engine. The heavy-set man stepped into view and began signaling too. I grabbed my Citizens Band radio microphone. Most drivers leave the radio on channel 19, although plenty keep the volume low at night. I said that any driver in the East Overflow area needed to call 911. I told them 2 men were trying to make me move my tractor with an injured person beneath the drive tires. My voice sounded much calmer over the radio than I felt. The flatbed driver beside me answered almost immediately. He asked which truck. I described mine and said I was directly beside him. His curtain opened fully. A few seconds later, the flatbed's horn sounded. Then another truck horn answered from across the lot. The maintenance employee stopped signaling. He looked beneath the tractor again, this time from farther away. I saw his flashlight settle on the injured man's hands. The black ties were clearly visible. The employee backed away from the thin man. The thin man reached for his arm. The employee pulled free and began walking quickly toward the service building. That was when both suspects dropped the act. The thin man ran toward my passenger door and climbed onto the step. He pulled the handle, then struck the window with a small metal object. The first impact made a sharp cracking sound. The glass did not break, but it left a mark near the bottom corner. I moved away from the passenger side and pressed myself against the driver's door. The thin man struck the window again. The heavy-set man circled around the front of the tractor. The dispatcher told me officers were entering the property. I could not see them yet. The flatbed driver opened his door. He was an older man with a white beard. He remained on the upper step of his cab and held his phone in front of him, recording. He did not approach the suspects, which was the smart thing to do. He simply shouted that police were coming and that both men were on camera. The thin man stepped down from my truck. The heavy-set man looked toward the frontage road. Blue lights had appeared near the fuel entrance. Both suspects ran for the pickup. The heavy-set man reached the driver's side first. The thin man climbed into the passenger seat while the truck was already beginning to move. They reversed down the lane behind my trailer. A tanker had pulled forward from one of the rows and stopped across part of the exit. I do not know whether the driver had heard my radio call or simply saw the commotion, but his trailer blocked the most direct path to the frontage road. The pickup swerved around him and cut between 2 parked tractors. One of its mirrors struck the side of a trailer and broke away. The pickup continued toward the motel. A marked patrol vehicle entered through the opening in the fence at the same time. The pickup driver tried to turn around the patrol vehicle. He climbed a curb, crossed a strip of dead grass, and hit the motel's chain-link fence. The fence bent but did not collapse. The pickup became wedged between the fence and a concrete drainage barrier. Both doors opened. The thin man ran behind the motel. The heavy-set driver made it only a few steps before an officer stopped him beside the fence. 2 more patrol vehicles entered the lot. One continued around the motel after the passenger. I stayed inside the cab. Even after I saw the heavy-set man on the ground with his hands behind his back, I did not unlock the doors. The dispatcher told me to remain where I was until an officer came to me. That took less than a minute. It felt much longer. An officer approached from the front with one hand raised where I could see it. I lowered the window a few inches and confirmed that I had called. He asked whether the brakes were set. I said both the tractor and trailer brakes were engaged and had been the entire time. He told me not to touch anything. Emergency medical personnel arrived shortly after. They crawled beneath the tractor from the passenger side. One of them cut the plastic ties around the man's wrists, while another stabilized his head. They removed the tape from his mouth and placed an oxygen mask over his face. I could not hear what the injured man said. I saw his eyes open once. It took several people to slide him onto a board and move him away from the tires. They carried him to the ambulance and left almost immediately. By then, officers had found the second suspect behind the motel. He had tried to hide inside an outdoor utility enclosure. A maintenance worker saw him climbing the fence and pointed officers in the right direction. Both men were taken away. I assumed I would be allowed to leave after giving a statement. Instead, the entire area around my tractor became a crime scene. An officer photographed the ground, the drive tires, the passenger door, and the small mark where the suspect had struck the window. Another officer crawled beneath the tractor and collected pieces of gray tape and one cut plastic tie. They asked me to shut down the engine, but leave the brakes set. I remained in the cab for close to an hour while they worked. Eventually, a detective arrived and asked me to explain everything from the moment I entered the lot. I told him about the man asking for a ride. I described the dark pickup, the split lip, the offer of $200, and the question about when I would leave. I told him about waking to the truck moving on its suspension. I repeated the sentence I had heard beneath the sleeper, "Get his arm in." The detective wrote it down. He asked whether I had performed an inspection after parking. I said I had. That turned out to be important. My company's application recorded the exact time I completed the post-trip inspection. It also stored the photograph I had taken of the trailer seal. The picture did not show the area beneath the tractor, but the timestamp supported what I had said. The electronic log showed that the truck had remained stationary from shortly after 1 in the morning until police arrived. The engine control system also recorded that the transmission had never been placed into gear after I parked. There was no mechanical possibility that I had driven over the man and forgotten about it. The detective asked whether my truck had exterior cameras. It had a forward-facing camera mounted near the windshield, but no cameras aimed at the sides or rear. The forward camera showed me entering the overflow lot and pulling into the space. It also showed that nobody had been lying in front of the tractor when I arrived. It did not show what happened behind the cab during the night. The truck plaza had security cameras covering the fuel island, store entrances, and main parking area. The overflow lot was only partly visible. The motel had several cameras. Most of those worked. Police reviewed the recordings while I waited. A little before 8 in the morning, the detective returned and asked me to watch part of the video. It was recorded from a camera mounted above the motel office. The image was grainy and had no sound, but it showed the opening in the fence and much of the truck overflow area. At a little after 3 in the morning, the dark pickup left a parking space beside the motel. It stopped behind my trailer with its lights off. The 2 suspects got out. They opened the rear door and pulled the man in the tan jacket from the back seat. His hands were already tied. They dragged him across the asphalt using his jacket and the back of his belt. He appeared unconscious. His boots struck the ground as they moved him between the trailers. That was the scraping sound I had heard. The video did not clearly show them placing him beneath my tractor because another trailer blocked the camera's view. It showed both men disappear beside my truck. Several minutes later, my exterior work lights came on. The suspects immediately returned to the pickup and left. The bump that woke me had almost certainly been the injured man's body striking the fuel tank or one of the suspension components. The detective said turning on the lights might have saved the man's life. The suspects had not finished positioning him when they left. One of his arms was still extended outward. That was apparently what they had been discussing when I heard them. Had I remained asleep, they might have pushed him farther beneath the truck. Had I gotten out, I might have encountered both of them in the dark. I asked why they had returned at sunrise. The detective did not know yet. He said they may have been watching from somewhere nearby. They could have expected me to leave earlier. When I started the engine but did not move, they might have assumed something had gone wrong. The pickup had also left the motel property for more than an hour. Police believed the suspects had used that time to dispose of the injured man's belongings. They found his phone later that morning in a drainage ditch beside the frontage road. The truck remained in place until close to noon. My company sent another driver to take the trailer and complete the delivery. A mobile mechanic disconnected the tractor from it after officers finished photographing the fifth wheel area. I was taken to the police station to give a formal statement. By that point, I had been awake most of the night. I remember sitting beneath fluorescent lights with a paper cup of coffee, repeating the same details until I was no longer sure which parts I had already said. The detective was patient. He explained that repetition was useful. People sometimes remembered small details during the second or third account. The only additional detail I remembered was the dark mark near the injured man's mouth when he approached me. I had assumed it was a split lip. It probably was. The suspects had already struck him before he asked for the ride. Late that afternoon, the detective told me the man had survived. He had a fractured jaw, several broken ribs, a concussion, and injuries to both wrists from the plastic ties. He was also suffering from exposure after lying beneath the truck in freezing temperatures. He had not been run over. The outer drive tire had been touching the shoulder of his jacket, but the weight of the tractor was not on him. The tire had settled close enough to leave a curved black mark on the fabric. I was released that evening. My company put me in a motel on the other side of Amarillo while they arranged for the tractor to be returned. I did not sleep much. I kept thinking about the moment before I climbed out for the inspection. The air pressure had been full. The engine was running. All I needed to do was push in 2 brake knobs and place the transmission into gear. My tractor had enough torque to move 40,000 pounds of freight from a complete stop. It would not have noticed a human body. A few weeks later, the detective called me with more information. The injured man had known both suspects. The 3 of them had come to Amarillo together from another part of Texas. They were involved in a planned theft connected to a drug transaction at the motel. The details changed depending on which person was speaking, but the basic story was that a large amount of cash had gone missing from one of the rooms. The man in the tan jacket had taken it. He had tried to leave before the other 2 realized what he had done. That was why he approached me. He was not stranded because his brother had abandoned him. He was attempting to escape the motel before the others found him. The $200 he offered was real. Police found more cash sewn into the lining of his jacket after he reached the hospital. When he walked away from my truck, the pickup followed him. The motel cameras showed him entering a rear stairwell. The suspects caught him on the second floor and forced him into a room. They beat him, tied his hands, and questioned him about the missing money. At some point, he told them about the eastbound truck. He said I was going to Oklahoma City after sunrise. The suspects knew which tractor he meant because they had seen him speaking to me. According to the detective, the idea of putting him beneath the truck came from the heavyset man. They did not have some intelligent plan to make the death look completely accidental. The bindings alone would have made that impossible. Their thinking was much simpler. They wanted someone else to perform the physical act. They believed I would wake up in the dark, start the truck, and drive forward without looking underneath it. By the time anyone discovered what had happened, my tractor would be on Interstate 40. Even if investigators eventually determined that the man had been placed there deliberately, the suspects expected the immediate confusion to give them time to leave Amarillo. They also knew that a loaded tractor could destroy physical evidence. The detective said one of them had described it as letting the truck finish it. I never learned which one said that. The injured man admitted his role in the events at the motel and faced charges of his own after recovering. He was not an innocent person. He had stolen money, participated in the original scheme, and lied to me about why he needed a ride. None of that meant he deserved to be crushed beneath a truck. Both suspects eventually accepted plea agreements on charges connected to the kidnapping and attempted killing. The heavyset man received the longer sentence because investigators believed the plan had been his. The second man also received decades in prison. I was asked to provide a written statement, but did not have to testify. The video, the emergency call, the physical evidence beneath the truck, and the injured man's account were enough. My company replaced the damaged passenger window and returned the tractor to me several days later. Before I drove it away, I performed a full inspection. When I reached the passenger side drive tires, there was still a faint black mark on the outer tire where the man's jacket had touched it. The mark was only a few inches above the pavement. That was how close he had been. If I had pushed in the brakes before getting out of the cab, the police report would have said that I killed him.